Lord of Industrialization. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story in all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 51. A group of people are plotting to steal the cabbages in other people's yards. Is it delicious? Delicious. If it's delicious, eat more. Mother said I can't eat too much sweets, it'll rot my teeth. It's okay, just brush your teeth afterward. Frederick took advantage of Katie's opportunity to feed Maria to reach for the plate on the coffee table. On the plate were cheese rolls. They were made by wrapping dough around a metal cylinder, then deep frying it until crispy. The rolls were then filled with melted cheese and allowed to cool and solidify. You can also add chopped nuts or candied fruit, making them crispy and sweet. Pa, Katie slapped Frederick's paw away, glaring at him and saying, "This is for Maria." Frederick curled his lips and turned to look at Richardnell, only to see his master's face filled with kindness and happiness. Richardnell looked at the two dark-haired girls, one old and one young, and said, if Katie had married the same age as the other girls, their children would have been Maria's age. Frederick was speechless. Finally, Maria asked Katie, "Sister Katie, can I give Frederick a cheese roll?" Katie replied softly, "Of course." Then she turned to Frederick and said, "Come over and thank Maria." Perhaps because of their shared black hair and eyes, Katie and Maria hit it off perfectly, and Richard now imagined Maria as his granddaughter. Frederick couldn't stand staying in the living room any longer, so he thanked Maria and ran off with a cheese roll in his mouth. He arrived at Psyche's room and found her sitting by the window, sewing a red-hooded cape. Frederick walked over, took a look, raised his brow, and asked, "Is it for Maria?" "Yes," Psyche asked with a half-smile. "Do you feel out of favor now?" "Not at all," Frederick shrugged. "I'm not a child." "Oh, right," he said, pretending to have just thought of something. "Maria has a talent for soul magic. Would you like to teach her?" Psyche replied, "No rush. She's still young, and her soul isn't developing yet. Let's talk about it in a few years. What game are you going to play with her today?" Frederick spread his hands and said helplessly, "There's really nothing fun. Let's play croquet later." Psyche looked up at him, as if she had seen a ghost. Frederick was frustrated. With the current productivity, this was all they could produce. Yesterday, they had been blowing bubbles together. He had haphazardly devised the rules of croquet. The number and location of the goals were random. Players had to hit their balls through the goals in order, without hitting the opponent's ball, or they would receive an extra stroke. There was a small bell hanging above the goal. The ball had to hit the wooden pole, and the player had to be strong enough to ring the bell on top of the pole. The one with the fewest strokes won. The playing surface was simple, the grass in the garden, though obstacles added to the challenge. Maria was now at an age where she was interested in everything. Croquet wasn't a demanding sport, requiring a bit of skill, but the rules were simple, and she had a blast. Frederick also let her play, and the odds were obvious. Maria, donning Psyche's red-hooded cape, ran around the garden like a ball of fire. As he played, Frederick looked up at the sun and suddenly noticed a line of heads staring at him and Maria from the ballista platform not far from the garden. All the military and political leaders of Wesson were present, including Richardnell and Philip, who he had drunk under the table the previous night, and Archbishop Victor. Philip knew without hesitation that these guys were after the cabbages in his yard. Wessenland currently faces a problem, a significant age gap among the second generation of the powerful. Older ones, like Taro and Jurgen, are only 16 or 17, while the younger ones haven't even been born yet. There aren't any girls within 5 years of Frederick's age. The families of the surrounding lords have suitable women of suitable age, but aristocratic marriages are political and economic partnerships, and given the current political situation, that's out of the question. News of Maria's existence and Frederick's behavior reached Wessenland as early as the beginning of the refugee reception, via Taro, who cared for Frederick, and old Franz, who managed the internment camp. Unbeknownst to Frederick, certain individuals had already exchanged views through various channels and reached some consensus. No one here could speak for the Wesson family, only Richardnell could represent Frederick personally. So, in a personal capacity, he asked Philip, "What do you think of Frederick?" Philip calmly replied, "The children are still too young. Let's wait 2 years. 2 years from now, on Maria's godfather's 80th birthday, there will be a large hunt." The Wesson leaders understood his meaning. Frederick still had the unresolved issue of King William, and 2 years from now was when the king was expected to take action. Whether the Wesson family would be doomed, or whether he could cling to the Archduke of Mainz to weather the storm, depended on Frederick's decision. Richard nodded and said, "Well, no one can predict what will happen in the future." Philip breathed a sigh of relief. If the Sword Saint resorted to force, he was still unsure whether he could withstand it. Archbishop Victor then said, "Wessenberg University is full of scholars. It would be a great place for Miss Maria to study there in the future." Philip's forehead was almost furious, wondering why the Archbishop had even joined in the fun. "Let's talk about it in a few years," he continued, stalling. "Maria is still young, she's young, but that doesn't matter." Manuel, the vice president of the University of Wessenberg, then appeared. "We have excellent tutors, our university is located by the lake, with fresh air. Your wife has weak lungs, so it's perfect for recuperation there." Philip's face darkened. These people had gone too far. Not only did they target their daughter, but they even targeted their wife. After lunch, "Goodbye, Frederick." "Goodbye, Sister Katie," Maria waved from the carriage. "I'm going back now. Remember to come visit me in the spring." Frederick waved back, saying, "We'll visit you when the milk vetch blooms." Philip's reason for running away was simple: he was worried about his wife's health. Maria, worried about her mother, agreed to return immediately. After Maria left, Frederick exchanged a glance with Katie, then rolled up his sleeves and headed back to the castle, ready to give someone a beating. Katie was furious that Maria had been brought home so early. After hearing what her father had said about the morning's incident, she knew who to blame, so she and Frederick prepared to go and beat them up. But those people were all very good at watching the situation and had already run away without a trace. Psyche, holding a lollipop in her mouth, said to Frederick, "Actually, it's a good thing she went home early." Frederick glared at her and asked, "How can that be considered a good thing? Why didn't you make it clear that from now on, everyone will eat only vegetables and not meat every day?" Psyche said with a funny look on her face, "If you spend every other day with her, and if she says to you, 'I'm sorry, I think you're my brother, and I don't think anything else about you,' what will you do?" Frederick's mouth suddenly twitched. Chapter 52 I almost forgot to plant vegetables. A rumor has been circulating in Wessenberg lately. The young master's favorite girl has run away, and in his grief and anger, his mind is spinning, saying he's going to plant vegetables. Everyone who heard the rumor glanced at their autumn clothes and burst into laughter. It was already October, and the autumn planting had already ended. Planting vegetables now would only produce a few leaves before winter set in November. It was too late. People simply laughed it off, dismissing it as the young master's childish tantrum, which would heal in a short while. One person also thought Frederick was just messing around until the president actually took him to the fields. At Wessenberg University, Diesel had been in charge of staff placement and other tasks, then busy with research assigned by the president. He had only left campus today to report on his progress, but upon arriving at the manor, he was caught working in the vegetable fields. Living in the stone castle during the winter was unpleasant, so every October, everyone moved to a manor outside the city until March of the following year. "Did you blow up the well?" Diesel asked, pointing to the meadow by the stream. "Yes," Frederick replied. "The river in this manor freezes over in winter, so we need to dig several deep wells for use during the winter." Diesel glanced at the vegetable patch where a rammed earth wall was being built nearby and asked in confusion, "Principal, you're not really planning to grow vegetables in this cold weather, are you?" Frederick had heard this question too many times recently, and replied a little impatiently, "Just do as I say. If you can, don't eat the vegetables you've grown." Diesel agreed, considering it was a piece of cake. He waved his wand, chanted an incantation, and in the blink of an eye, several blue cones appeared above the grass. The first cone in the middle dropped, instantly piercing the grass. A loud bang followed, and oil erupted from the ground like a volcanic eruption. The other cones followed suit, and after a series of explosions, a hole approximately 2 meters in diameter and 9 meters deep was dug. Diesel said proudly, "This is the latest magic I've developed, following the principal's suggestion. It can focus a large number of shock waves in one direction, perfect for blasting out the dirt." Frederick asked happily, "Great, can the magic circle be miniaturized?" Diesel replied, "That's a bit difficult at the moment, Frederick nodded, leaving the magic research for later. He now had someone come and reinforce the well walls. "I have some work to do this morning," he told Diesel. "I'll see your results this afternoon." He'd been so busy that he'd forgotten something important, only to remember it when Terrell reported on the dried and pickled vegetables he'd stored for the winter. Diesel naturally agreed, curious about what the principal was doing. He was then assigned to blow up several wells. When Diesel finished, a convoy arrived at the vegetable patch. BASF himself accompanied the convoy, his carriages laden with the bundles of transparent slime film. "Principal," BASF said mysteriously as he jumped off the carriage. "Come visit our workshop sometime. We have a surprise." Frederick didn't ask what the surprise was, figuring he wouldn't tell even if he did. He pointed to a vegetable patch where rammed earth walls and wooden scaffolding had already been built. "Pull a cart of film over there and see if we can build a greenhouse this morning," he said. No one wasted a word. BASF had a cart carrying the film taken to the edge of the vegetable patch, and Frederick had the stewards gather the tenants to work. The vegetable patch was 50 meters long and 5 meters wide, with wooden scaffolding that ran higher in the north and lower in the south. On the north side stood a thick, 4-meter-high rammed earth wall with several wooden doors and windows. Frederick and the estate steward took measurements, while BASF had a roll of greenhouse unloaded from a cart and unrolled at the edge of the field. "It's so tall?" Diesel asked BASF in surprise. "How did you do it?" The unrolled film roll was 3 meters wide, an estimated 20 meters long, and about 1 millimeter thick. "Simple, huh?" BASF said proudly. "I prepared a stone floor, over 3 meters wide and 5 meters long. I poured the slime glue on it, had people spread it out, and then used a wheeled scraper at a fixed height to scrape it across. When it cooled, it became a large sheet of film. When I make the next sheet, I leave 3 finger widths of the previous sheet side by side and fuse them with a new sheet. When it cools, it becomes a large sheet." Following his instructions, Diesel saw that the film had thicker lines at regular intervals. Frederick had measured the film needed for the greenhouse and then began to piece it together. A small fire was lit nearby, and the cut film was boiled in an iron pot. Once it melted, he brushed it against the overlapping pieces while it was still hot. Before it cooled and solidified, he pressed it firmly, forming a single, large sheet. The assembled film was rolled into a large piece, and a large group of people worked together to lift it onto the rammed earth wall. Once they let go, the film rolled over and laid itself onto the pre-erected wooden frame. The adults secured the film to the rammed earth wall and the ground. Girls, roughly Frederick's age, tied ropes around their waists and carefully slid down to the slippery, sloping roof of the greenhouse, like they were on a slide. With awls in hand and thin hemp ropes tied around their arms, they worked with the adults inside to tie the film to the wooden frame. Finally, they applied a thick layer of slime glue to the ropes and the perforations. By noon, everyone was busy, finally completing the film. The sun was still strong today, and even after gathering for a while, the heat was already building. Diesel exclaimed in surprise, "It seems like we can actually grow vegetables in winter this way." Frederick smiled and said, "Almost there. We need straw mats to cover the shed at night, a charcoal stove, and thick curtains behind the door and windows. In the past, snowfall was necessary, so we had to clear it promptly. Most importantly, we need to provide safety education, otherwise we could get carbon monoxide poisoning." Winters in Western territory can reach temperatures as low as -10 degrees Celsius, with strong winds and heavy snowfall. For thousands of years, countless people have died from carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide poisoning while heating their homes. However, due to the limited development of alchemy, people only discovered carbon dioxide, which can turn limestone cloudy, and thus called it carbon dioxide. These two factors were Frederick's greatest concerns, so the roof of the shed was steeply sloped to facilitate snowfall. But snow removal was also necessary during heavy snowfalls. Several windows were also cut into the rammed earth walls, which could be opened as needed to reduce the carbon dioxide concentration inside the shed and adjust the humidity. Frederick had a few words with the manager of the manor, and asked him to manage the construction of the greenhouses. Every time a greenhouse was built, he asked the farmer to prepare the land inside immediately, apply fertilizer, and plant some green leafy vegetables with short growth cycles such as lettuce, romaine lettuce and arugula. Chapter 53. There are still some problems. In the manor garden, Frederick ate a Wesson bun in the pavilion while Diesel explained his research findings. It was a steel can the size of a soda can. The magic circle was on the outside of the hemispherical base, with a 50mm diameter opening at the other end. This Jetkin magic circle utilizes the latest spherical magic circle technology and telekinesis, Diesel said proudly. This allows the magic circle to be on the outside of the can while the magic appears and operates inside, protecting the magic circle from being destroyed by the magic itself. Frederick nodded, then asked, "Is there any data to quantify its power?" Diesel paused, thought for a moment, and replied, "Currently, there's no universally accepted method for quantifying magic power. Different people and places have their own methods of determining it, such as how thick a piece of iron can be penetrated or how long it takes to melt a certain weight of iron." Frederick curled his lips. This was a huge problem. Without a standardized metric to determine the power of magic, future work would be difficult. Thus, future students in this world would learn in their textbooks, 1 Frederick energy equals the work done by the point of application of 1 Wesson force moving 1 meter in the direction of the force. Henry is the amount of energy, measured in Fredericks, converted, used, or dissipated per second. 1 Carolina is the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius at 1 atmosphere of pressure, and 1 Maria equals 1 Wesson per square meter, but that would have to wait. Right now, the most important thing was how to judge the power of Diesel's new invention. After a moment's thought, Frederick said, "This jet tank's function is to propel projectiles, replacing the bow and arrow. In other words, the criterion for judging its power is how fast it can propel a projectile of a certain weight. The faster the arrow, the higher it flies, so we can use this method to quantify the power of this jet tank. My idea is this: hang a sandbag of the same length, size, and weight on a rope. Use this jet tank, attached to a section of tubing, to propel a ball of a certain weight, hitting the center of the sandbag at the closest possible distance. Once the ball enters the sandbag, it will transfer its force into it, pushing it in motion. The greater the force, the greater the maximum swing angle of the sandbag, and this angle is the quantified value of the force." Diesel pinched his chin and thought carefully for a while, then nodded. "You make sense. Some people use this method to compete in weapon swinging strength, so we can do the same." Frederick nodded and asked, "What are the problems you mentioned this morning?" Diesel said a little embarrassedly, "Principal, you wanted to make this jet tank portable, but there were some problems. You know, the power of magic is directly proportional to the amount of magic elements contained in the magic circle. If the magic circuit is half as wide, the magic circle's materials are reduced to a quarter. Similarly, the amount of magic elements is reduced to a quarter, and the magic power is reduced accordingly. If the jetkin was made the size of a finger, the power would be much less." Frederick pondered, holding the jetkin in his hand. This was indeed a problem. Then, remembering something, he asked, "If you speed up the magic elements, can you increase the power of the magic?" Diesel replied, "That's a common refrain among college kids, but everyone's mental strength is limited, and there's a limit to how fast you can accelerate magic elements." Frederick, perked up, asked, "So, how fast can you propel the magic elements?" Diesel said with some pride, "I'm fine. I've done special research to increase the power of magic, and I'm considered one of the best in Constantine." He raised his palm and condensed a ball wind element, which circulated at high speed. "What a pity." Frederick shook his head. Diesel asked curiously, "What's a pity?" Frederick, with an enigmatic look on his face, smiled without saying anything. Diesel was pushing the magic elements at a high speed, but still some distance from the critical speed where a collision would cause a violent explosion. Frederick picked up the jetkin and asked again, "So, is there a magic circle that can accelerate the movement of magic elements within a magic circle?" Diesel replied with a look of astonishment, "Yes, there are. You can even use multiple stages of acceleration to reach very high speeds." Frederick followed up, asking, "Are there any restrictions?" "Yes," Diesel nodded. "Material has magical resistance, and different materials have different values. The magical resistance of magic circuit materials is much lower than that of the base material, so magic elements will move in circuits with lower resistance. The material's magical resistance is related to the magic element's energy. As the magic element's speed and energy increase, the base material's magical resistance weakens, eventually piercing it and short-circuiting the magic circuit." Frederick blinked, understanding the meaning. Diesel concluded, "Precisely because of the magical resistance, the speed of magic elements has an upper limit. The higher the magical resistance, the slower the speed, and the more energy is lost." "I see," Frederick nodded. He hadn't learned about this subject yet. He thought for a moment and asked, If both the base material in the magic circuit were made of magical metal, could we achieve the same effect of increasing the speed of the magic elements? Of course, Diesel said, a smile of neediness on his face. The cost would be higher, but the university's current funding is insufficient. If the president can increase it, it would be fine. Frederick sighed helplessly and said, let's first develop the maximum possible under the current conditions. If it's larger, give me the data. I'll use it to generate revenue and then invest in further research. Prioritize testing with 50mm and 100mm caliber spray canisters. You can have a wider range of lengths. It seemed that the magic air gun still had some way to go, but the prerequisites were almost complete, and they could begin preparing the parts. Diesel replied, no problem, I'll arrange it, as long as there's enough funding. Frederick pretended not to hear about the funding issue, rubbing his chin in thought as he said, I think just throwing solid projectiles far away is a bit wasteful. If they're large projectiles, can't they be equipped with something cheap and explosive? When the cannons are deployed, they'll have to contend with magic shields. Only by overloading and collapsing the magic shields can they effectively destroy the targets behind them. Solid bullets aren't impossible, but to someone like Frederick, who has a phobia of insufficient firepower, what's a cannonball if it can't explode? If magic bullets aren't enough, then they'll have to resort to black powder. That's no problem, Diesel said, pleasantly surprised. There's a technique for explosively activating magic circles. It uses the massive amount of violent magic elements generated by the explosion of magic crystals to activate the magic circle in a very short time. Only a small amount of magic crystals or magic cores is needed to achieve a powerful effect. This method will severely damage the magic circuit materials and is generally single-use. Frederick thought he'd found a way to improve the jet tank, but after hearing the final word, he decided against it. But he immediately thought of something, his lips curled up slightly, and he told Diesel his idea. Diesel was stunned, thought for a moment, and said, this can be done. Frederick smiled brightly and said, then let's do it. Diesel immediately said, there's not enough funding. Frederick frowned and said, I'll see how much money the bearing factory, sugar factory, and ironworks have at the end of the year. I'll give it to you first. You can do some preliminary experiments. Make a wooden model to test the theory. It shouldn't be a problem. Diesel smiled and agreed after receiving the funding promise. Chapter 54. This pressure cooker is not simple. Frederick rested for a while, resuming his usual exercise and study sessions at the manor. On the afternoon of the day the third greenhouse opened, he and BASF, who had delivered the materials, arrived at the slime glue workshop. The slime glue workshop was now one of Wessenland's largest, employing hundreds. To manage it effectively, BASF had lost a lot of weight and developed some management skills. Frederick didn't bother to see the surprises, but instead walked through the production process. He first visited the largest crystal slime farm. It was arranged like a pigsty, with each pool practically filled with slimes, fed with kitchen waste purchased from Wessenland. Frederick asked BASF, are we getting enough materials? BASF replied, it's barely enough now, but after another expansion next year, it won't be enough. I plan to build workshops in other cities. Frederick frowned, thinking as he watched the crystal slimes bouncing in the pools. After a moment, he shook his head and said, we can just build a farm there. The workshop needs some improvements. I'll discuss this with you in detail later. Now that the victims have been relocated, they can free up their hands to address the upgrade from the handicraft workshop to a factory-based handicraft industry, or even a rudimentary factory. This can't be rushed. Frederick intends to conduct thorough research before making a decision. With a boss's word, BASF agreed. The two left the farm and arrived at a slaughterhouse. Crystal slimes are doused in a little strong liquor before being released. Once they pass out, they're brought here, cleaned, cut into pieces, and fed into the meat grinder. Previously, small batch production involved removing the slime's internal organs, but this has been eliminated. Buckets of slime sauce are transported directly to the cooking room. The cooking room, with its roof and no walls, houses two of Frederick's latest inventions, a honeycomb coal stove and a pressure cooker. Frederick was startled by the row of pressure cookers. A large pressure cooker, half a meter in diameter and about 60 centimeters tall, sat atop the stove. The honeycomb briquettes underneath were mounted on a cart. When the briquettes were changed, they were pulled out, leaving the pot untouched. The lid was secured with a crossbeam, lugs, and screws. Steam caused the weight on the exhaust valve to bounce. Next to each steaming pressure cooker was a small hourglass. When the hourglass ran out, workers would remove the briquettes and pour water over them to force cool them. Only when the weight stopped escaping would the lid be opened. Such a large pot, Frederick asked hurriedly. Is it safe? BASF replied, it's absolutely safe. These pots are made by Professor Ahmet using earth element steel. They're incredibly strong. If the exhaust valve gets blocked, the safety valve on the other side of the lid will also activate. We're also planning to weld chains to the lid so it won't fly too far if it explodes. This type of pressure cooker is the one I've chosen after numerous experiments. It produces higher pressures and temperatures, and the resulting porridge is of better quality. Frederick was reassured. Cheap elemental steel, a new specialty product brought to Western territory by All Might, has already gained a reputation. Earth steel, used in pressure cookers, is a type of elemental metal, steel reinforced with earth elements. Traditional elemental steel making involves adding high-quality magic crystal powder to the steel ingot during forging or casting. During the long forging process, the magical elements activated by these magic crystals transform the steel and are eventually expelled along with the impurities. Earth steel boasts greater strength than ordinary steel and is often used to create key components of armor. Manufacturing elemental steel requires expensive, high-quality magic crystal powder, otherwise, the magical elements within it cannot be activated during forging. Once the magic crystal powder degrades to medium quality, it can no longer activate the remaining elements, necessitating the addition of new, high-quality magic crystal powder, resulting in a very high cost. The manufacturing process for other elemental metals is similar to that for earth steel. Different magical elements impart different properties to the metal. Commonly used magic elements in elemental metal making include fire to raise the melting point, electricity to increase corrosion resistance, gold to increase hardness, water to enhance plasticity, wood to increase toughness, light to increase magical affinity and reduce magical resistance, and dark to increase magical resistance. Elemental metals aren't limited to steel. Lead can even rival pig iron in hardness. This magical elemental enhancement is the product of the enhancement value and the original properties of the base metal. The stronger the base, the stronger the enhanced properties. Several magical elements can also simultaneously enhance a single metal, creating composite elemental metals. The price difference between ordinary metals and elemental metals is as great as that between boiled cabbage and boiled cabbage. The price of earthen steel is equivalent to its weight in silver. Currently, the wholesale price in Wessenland is equivalent to its weight in silver. Large quantities are available, and the cost price is confidential. However, since it's all used to make pressure cookers, the cost isn't likely to be much higher. For years, countless researchers have been researching ways to reduce the cost of elemental steel, with some success. So far, only All Might has achieved a breakthrough. Frederick thought this was the surprise BASF was talking about, but he pointed to a large patch of grass outside and said, let's go over there. There's a big surprise. The grass was overgrown with weeds, which hadn't been cleared away during the workshop construction. Frederick walked over to the grass and took a look, immediately noticing something amiss. Although the grass had withered and browned, it was still noticeable that the grass near the steaming plant was taller than that farther away. BASF said proudly, boss, I've discovered that the slurry from cooking is a good fertilizer. We dumped the slurry directly here. At first, we thought the grass grew better here because it was hotter near the stove. Then, as the slurry grew too much, it burned the grass. Whenever it rained, it turned into mud. So we started dumping it farther away, and we found that the grass grew even more lush there. Frederick rubbed his chin in thought. Since wood ash and bones could be used to fertilize the fields, then using pressure-cooked slime to fertilize the fields wasn't out of the question. Notify Professor Matthias, Frederick said. He'll be coming to the estate soon to research greenhouse vegetable cultivation. You two can work together to study the effects of the slurry. Let's leave the professional matters to the experts. BASF immediately agreed. If the slurry could truly be used as fertilizer, it would be a significant source of income for the workshop and a step closer to buying a house and getting married in Wiesenberg. At the other end of the cooking room, workers placed the cooked slime paste into a bed-sized iron pan, with a fire burning underneath, boiling the paste dry to form molten glue. While still hot, the glue was squeezed out of a heated noodle machine. A scraper scraped the resulting slime into small particles, which then fell into a pool of water to cool and solidify. This became the raw slime glue. In different workshops, it was reheated and melted, then reacted with various materials to create glue for different uses, which in turn became various products. Tableware was produced using a molding process. A specific spoon scooped a spoonful into a mold, and another mold pressed it, resulting in bowls or plates. The burrs were trimmed off and the pieces could be sold. Frederick spotted an unexpected person there. George. Frederick was surprised. "What are you doing here if you're not supervising the glass workshop?" George, who had been pushed over by the Grand Duke of Mainz, was lost in thought. He looked ordinary, with his cheeks puffed out, a characteristic of glass blowers. Interrupted and realizing it was Frederick, he immediately replied respectfully, "Your Excellency, I'm wondering if a glass workshop could use this method to produce tableware." Frederick replied matter-of-factly, "Of course." "Any questions?" George, meeting Frederick for the second time today, didn't feel the respect he'd once felt from the social norms of the Wesson County community, nor the recognition he'd received from the University of Wessenberg after discussing academic matters with him. Furthermore, as the favored illegitimate son of the Grand Duke of Mainz and an expert in glassmaking, he felt a little annoyed that such a child had trivialized the very issue he'd been pondering. "It's not that simple," George shook his head. "It involves a lot of factors, like the glass's composition and processing temperature." Just as he waited for the young baron to inquire about the issue and then boast about his experience, Frederick calmly said, "Indeed, it requires extensive experimentation and data to resolve." With that, Frederick, ignoring George's quizzical expression, led him to BASF's shoe workshop. Like traditional craftsmen, George focused on accumulating experience, while Frederick prioritized relying on data to determine optimal techniques, a difficult position for traditionalists to grasp. On the way, Bass asked Frederick curiously, "Principal, you don't seem to like this guy." They felt the principal had always been enthusiastic and respectful of skilled individuals, but this was the first time he'd been so cold and emotionless. "Nothing," Frederick shook his head slightly. George was a man the Grand Duke of Mainz had forced upon him because he had a conflict with Philip. Frederick had originally wanted to develop a microscope, so he accepted him. Now that the situation had changed, Frederick was showing George how to mold vessels, a gesture of respect to the Grand Duke of Mainz. After all, his relationship with Philip was much closer, so he couldn't afford to be close to George. When someone like George was in the presence of Baron Wesson, if Baron Wesson gave the Grand Duke of Mainz face, he was a figure; if he didn't, he was just an ordinary person. Frederick was trying to entice the Grand Duke of Mainz, and Philip was a close confidant of the Grand Duke. This relationship was more legitimate and more secure than George's. BASF didn't press the issue, but said, "I was thinking of buying a glass tea set when the glass workshop is operational, when I get married." Frederick looked around to see if there was anyone around and whispered, "Don't worry, I have a fat pig ready to be slaughtered, and the glass workshop is no problem." BASF's eyes lit up, but he added worriedly, "But he saw our craftsmanship." Frederick curled his lips and asked, "How much do you think I should charge you for those pressure cookers?" BASF immediately understood that pressure cookers made of this special material would be ridiculously expensive on the market. Without the raw materials, learning the downstream technology would be useless. He could even make a profit selling the raw materials, while others would just earn a hard-earned income. "Think about it now," Frederick said. "There's no technology that never becomes obsolete, and no technology that never leaks. An industry is like a chain. All you have to do is control the most profitable parts." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 55, A Thought Arises, The World Becomes Wider. One afternoon, while Basf had been contemplating the identity of that fat pig, Archbishop Victor, who had recently made a trip to the Holy City, returned to Frederick's study. Frederick placed the opening of his book, The Three Properties of Force and the Energy of Motion, and a conjecture on why we stand on the earth, in a drawer. He joined the Archbishop on the sofa and asked Taro to brew a pot of warm ginger tea. Archbishop Victor looked exhausted, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. Wherever there are people, there are rivalries, and the Church of Light was no exception. Due to differences in region and philosophy, the various factions fought fiercely. Frederick didn't bother to delve into the fate of Victor's faction, only knowing that he was under siege from all sides within the church. Victor's position was simple: simply meet his KPIs quickly. However, Almost all secular governments had abandoned him, and the Wesson territory was his only hope. The right didn't expire, and Archbishop Victor was still able to forcibly control many of the Rhine Archdiocese's resources. Frederick was playing his cards right. Sometimes, those in charge are often confused, while those on the sidelines can see more clearly. Frederick had consulted the religious history of his homeland, combined with his own interests and the local situation, to devise a win-win solution. Archbishop Victor came to Frederick with sincerity, and after gulping down his ginger tea, he said, "I've returned to the Holy City and found the cardinal from the Diocese of Gaul. We've agreed to canonize your father, Count Henry von Wesson." During the canonization ceremony on next year's spring equinox, the archbishop didn't dare to look down on the child pouring him tea. His idea for boosting his KPI was to build a monastery in Wesson, a school for clergy, which happened to be lacking in the Southern Rhine Confederation. He could use this project as a cover to maintain his position for the next few years, and since it was being funded by public funds, he would have a place to stay even if he lost a fight. Frederick's offer was the title of saint in exchange. Sainthood is bestowed only upon the deceased, a title more prestigious than substantial, unattainable. Each archdiocese receives one nomination annually, and as long as the case is not too outrageous, it's generally accepted. Frederick was furious that King William had framed his father. He lacked the strength to turn the tables immediately, and worried that if things dragged on, they would become ideologically stigmatized. So, he enlisted the help of the Church of Light to deliver a slap on the king. Among ordinary people, religion can sometimes be more effective than the king. Frederick had a series of tactics in store, and this was just the first. After pouring tea for Archbishop Victor, he said, "Thank you to the Church for upholding justice and protecting loyal men from disgrace. Oak Village will become the future Oak City on the canal. It's now a blank canvas. Let's build the monastery there." Building a monastery wasn't just about politics, it was about economics. The people's livelihoods would boost local development, and it was perfectly suited to boosting Oak Village. Victor didn't care about that at the moment, simply having a place was enough, and it had convenient waterways for both north and south travel. Naturally, he agreed. Frederick smiled and continued, "Weissenberg doesn't have a cathedral. I wonder if the Church of Light could build one in the city." Victor was delighted, another KPI boosting project on the horizon. A kind smile spread across his face, and he asked, "How much money does the Baron intend to donate to build such a church?" Frederick didn't answer, but whispered something to Taro. A moment later, Taro and several servants entered, carrying a large picture frame covered in white silk. The frame, measuring 1.5 meters wide and over 2 meters high, immediately caught Victor's attention. Frederick asked Taro and the servants to leave the study and went over to pull back the silk, revealing a rendering of a church. Church of Light churches were now beginning to have spires, symbolizing light, but they were neither tall nor steep. On the white canvas, a cathedral with a spire over 160 meters high gave Archbishop Victor a striking Gothic aura. Frederick had taken a European architectural history course in college in a previous life, and had some understanding of Gothic architecture, so he drew Elmünster Cathedral. He had sketched the painting himself in black ink and had Katie retouch it. While crude for an oil painting, the outlines were still clear enough. Archbishop Victor, regaining his composure, turned to Frederick. "Does your excellency have that much money?" It was common knowledge that Frederick was broke, and his question indirectly indicated that the church wouldn't pay. The cathedral was so vast that even with sufficient funding, it would take 20 or 30 years to complete. It wouldn't be surprising if it took 200 or 300 years if funds were insufficient. The church wouldn't take that risk. Frederick smiled and replied, "Of course not." Victor said, "It's a beautiful painting." Frederick continued, "This isn't my own church, so I wouldn't pay for it myself." Victor's intuition told him this little guy was about to make a shocking statement. "This is the Germanic Church," Frederick said excitedly, "so its funding comes naturally from all the Germanic believers." Even Archbishop Victor, knowledgeable and prepared, was still taken aback by the statement. The Germanic people, sharing similar language and customs, are spread across the Rhine Confederation and the eastern regions. Northward, they stretch across the sea to the southern shores of the Dark Land. The powerful Osmag Empire to the southeast is also primarily Germanic, and there's no telling how many nations they are scattered across. If this were said by a king or a noble, the archbishop would applaud enthusiastically. But now, it was said by an 8-year-old child, and the archbishop threw a healing spell at his head. Frederick glanced at Victor with a gloomy look and said, "My brain is fine. This church is not impossible to build." Victor leaned back on the sofa and said casually, "Tell me about your plan." Frederick's previous remarks were all preparation, but now the real purpose was revealed. He sat back on the sofa and said seriously, "I invite the Archbishop to preside over the translation of the Holy Scripture into Rhineland in the church in Weissenberg." Victor jumped up, his eyes wide and furious. It was because several of his political enemies had been clamoring for a translation of the Holy Scripture. For a long time, the Church of Light's Holy Codex was written in the archaic, crude language of the Puritan Empire, a position the Church relied on to assert its final right of interpretation to control its followers. Translating the Holy Codex into a local language would be tantamount to challenging the Church's authority, and Archbishop Victor naturally forbade it. Frederick smiled faintly, slowly taking a sip of the slightly cool ginger tea from his cup, unhurried. The first Germanic Pope of the Church of Light, his light-hearted words instantly calmed Archbishop Victor. Victor had been Pope in his dreams, and now he was free to do what he wanted. For the Pope, prestige and prestige were all sham, the power behind him was the real deal. Why would you expect others to support you in becoming Pope? As the saying goes, once the thought of becoming emperor arises, the world becomes vast. Since you can't defeat your enemies, why not join them, help them, unite them, and lead them? Previously, there was no opportunity, but now, using the translation of the Holy Codex as a catalyst, you can win over a group of people and then negotiate with others. As for the Church's authority, can it convince its political enemies to stop? Frederick was gambling on the Church's place in Victor's heart. Victor's eyes grew increasingly sharp. There were noble individuals within the Church of Light who dedicated their lives to the Church without seeking power, but he certainly wasn't one of them. Frederick probed, "The new monastery will need a lot of glass. Could the Archbishop help me find a group of skilled glass apprentices?" Victor knew he would undoubtedly make some conditions, though they seemed odd, so he asked, "Only apprentices? No craftsmen?" Frederick nodded. Victor assumed he already had craftsmen, so he said, "No problem. I know an apprentice who's been suppressed by his master and can't finish his apprenticeship. He's already quite old. I can help you find some such apprentices," Frederick said somewhat apologetically. "If that's the case, other craftsmen would be fine too. Our Wesson County Guild will officially launch a new professional certification system next year. They can take the test here and become official craftsmen upon passing." Victor agreed, then told them to mention it when they went back to the priest. Seeing the good mood, Frederick reached into his desk drawer and pulled something out. It was a rough, yellowish-brown paper that Katie and Keller had recently made on a small production line from scrap hemp rope, primarily for worker training. It was fine for wiping, but it needed to be folded in half first. Frederick placed the paper on the coffee table, poured a little tea into the saucer, and used the bottom of the cup to print a few circles on the paper. He handed it to Victor and said, "I'm experimenting with a cheap alternative to parchment. If successful, I can make the Rhineland-based Bible affordable for every German household. Other places can choose whichever language they want. My share of the profits will go toward the construction of the new church. These are preliminary results, but I don't have the funds for further research. Could you lend me some money?" Victor gazed at the paper for a long time, his breathing becoming heavier. Ensuring every household has a copy of the Bible, this KPI is no longer just about becoming Pope. Perhaps he could become the first person in church history to achieve sainthood while still alive. "How much money is still needed?" Archbishop Victor asked immediately. "Just consider it as the donation from the Archdiocese of Rhine to build the church." Frederick reported a number. Victor immediately agreed and guaranteed that the funds would be in place next month. A bright smile appeared on Frederick's face. The startup funds for the glass factory, cement factory and steam engine research were there. At this moment, Tarot came to report that the pagan merchants had arrived. Frederick reported to Archbishop Victor cautiously like a child who had done something wrong. In the eyes of the Archbishop, pagans were not as hateful as heretics. Pagans only wanted to empty your pockets, while heretics wanted your life. What do you say? If we use the money we earn from helping the pagans print scriptures to build the cathedral, would it be considered that the pagans are helping us build the church? Frederick blinked and looked at Archbishop Victor as if he had seen a ghost. My God, is this kind of thing possible? Chapter 56, Pagan Merchants. The late autumn evening arrived early, and it was already dark before dinner time. Frederick received Madame Sophie, who had returned from her long journey, in his living room. inviting Archbishop Victor to accompany her to avoid suspicion. Madame Sophie stared at Frederick silently for a moment before saying in her oddly accented Rhineland, "Not bad." She wore a plain white gown, her head and face swathed in a scarf and veil, revealing only her golden eyes and the dark, wheat-colored skin surrounding them. Her voice sounded devoid of emotion. Frederick said proudly, "How could I possibly have a problem? With your help, it's like embroidery on silk. I'm saying my own divination is correct, and you can survive this difficult time." "I'm not talking about you," Madame Sophie said coldly. "The relationship between me, Sophie, and you is simply that of a businessman and client. Don't imply that I'm colluding with the pagans." I know. Frederick's voice sounded coquettish. "Don't worry, I've kept the payment for the seeds. I've been short of money lately, even selling all the gold at home, and haven't touched a single bit." With a gesture, Taro placed a silver box on the coffee table in front of Madame Sophie. Inside was a collection of beautiful gems. The pagan merchant had spent 2 years traveling the east. Although he had spent all the inheritance that Frederick's grandmother Elizabeth had left him for a rainy day, the seeds he brought back were enough to make Frederick smile in his sleep. Not to mention the winter storable Chinese cabbage, the delicious broccoli, and the love or hate peppers, not to mention the vibrant red tomatoes, the delicious cucumbers, and the extravagantly golden pumpkins. The spring wheat and potatoes alone were enough to convince Frederick to give her the box of gems. Communication between East and West had always been ongoing, but due to the long and arduous journeys, trade was carried out by locals, resulting in distorted information and interrupted agricultural production due to unsuitable climate and soil conditions. This was enough to convince Madame Sophie to deceive Frederick by claiming soybeans were a panacea. Madame Sophie had successfully opened up the east-west route, and perhaps there would be significant business opportunities in the future. But Frederick had one question: how in the world did peppers, tomatoes, pumpkins, and potatoes end up in the east? Madame Sophie didn't know, so she didn't ask. Frederick decided to give up on the idea. While the geography of this world resembled his hometown, the Sahara Desert had been transformed into forest, and a vast expanse of land had grown to the west. It wouldn't be surprising if some strange things happened again. After returning, Sophie heard about the situation in Wessenland. She had first sent someone to help, but only returned to deliver the goods after she had captured all the rebels in her family. Now, with the money and the goods exchanged, everyone was happy. After receiving the final payment, Mrs. Sophie handed over the nautical charts, logbook, and travel logs to Frederick as agreed. Frederick smiled and said, "I think we can continue our cooperation." Madame Sophie asked, "What do you want to buy?" "Books," Frederick said. "Any books?" Madame Sophie's golden eyes narrowed slightly, and she asked, "Flame church books too?" Frederick smiled at Archbishop Victor, then said, "I'm planning to build a library and would like to collect some official editions of your church's books." Archbishop Victor, who was thinking of making money from them, said, "If it's just about collecting, that's fine. Churches also exchange books as gifts." He wondered if Frederick and I could give each family in the Southern Flame Church a book, and then we could be canonized. The thought of one person being canonized by two churches was exciting, and the idea of the Earth God Church and the Natural Church would be even more exciting. Madame Sophie, thinking that business meant selling everything, replied, "Sure, I'll find a translator if needed." Frederick suddenly had an idea. Why not set up a translation court to translate and publish books from various countries? Putting that aside, he also needed a specialty of the southern continent. "I need cotton," Frederick said. A lot of cotton. Cotton was readily available in the north. It didn't need to be woven, and even reselling it would bring in a good profit. Madame Sophie's golden eyes flickered as she said, "I can sell you all the cotton in our kingdom of Kush, and I can also buy a lot of cotton from the south and sell it to you." Frederick frowned slightly and asked, "What's the price?" The kingdom of Kush was no small nation. If they bordered the Rhine Confederation, they could crush it. Such a large quantity would be enough to make them die. Their cotton was naturally readily available, there was no need to rely on him for survival. Madame Sophie made her offer, simply and clearly, "Steel and elemental steel," Frederick said gloomily. "The current production is insufficient. You know, we're opening up new land and need a lot of tools." Madame Sophie said, "I want exclusive sales rights to the southern continent." Frederick thought for a moment and replied, "In principle, that's fine with me, but if others buy from me and resell them south, I can't do anything about it. Besides, I can't meet the needs of the entire southern continent. We're short on ore, coal, and magic crystals." "That's okay," Madame Sophie said. Hayradin will handle the first problem, as long as you don't sell to other southern countries. Second, I can export ore, coal, and magic crystals to you. Frederick disregarded her after she mentioned the name of a famous southern pirate, wanting no part in the bloodbath. The southern continent was presumably not peaceful either. Buying so much steel was likely for war preparations. He thought for a moment and said, the cotton won't be ready in time this year, and our production is insufficient. Let's start this business next cotton season. Madame Sophie agreed, and since neither side was stocked, she agreed. She then asked again, do you want a griffin? Frederick shook his head again and refused. No, don't think I don't know how cold weather they are. How many nobles in the north have been ripped off by you? Of course, if you're willing to sell me winged unicorns, I'll definitely buy 1 or 200. Archbishop Victor was surprised to find that Madame Sophie's beautiful golden eyes were rolling. Unicorns are common in the southern continent, held in the same esteem as horses, with price depending on the breed. In the north, they are mostly purchased by nobles for their rare magical talents, and unicorn kidneys are a popular men's gas station, but winged unicorns are different. They are one of the few magical beasts on the continent that can be tamed and carried in flight, making them a strategic commodity. Other such beasts include the griffins of the south, the flying deer of the northern darklands, the hippogriffs of the west, the giant eagles of the east, and the fire dragons that inhabit the mountains hundreds of kilometers south of Wessenland. Each of these beasts has its own unique characteristics. The winged unicorns are fast, but their defenses are low, making them unsuitable for charging enemies. The griffins are ferocious, but they are cold shy and confined to the south. The flying deer can carry a large load, but they need to dissipate heat quickly to avoid heatstroke, and are therefore confined to the north and south during the winter. The hippogriffs are easy to tame, but their intelligence is somewhat low, making them prone to impulsive behavior. The giant eagles soar high, but are difficult to breed, and their numbers are limited. The fire dragons are powerful and highly defensive, but require magical equipment to tame. They also share one common trait: they eat voraciously. 1 or 200 vegetarian winged unicorns could devour Frederick, forcing him to eat meat only once a month. A carnivorous fire dragon could reduce him to consuming grass roots. Only powerful states could afford to maintain such beasts on a large scale. Ordinary nobles could forget about it. Moreover, if Frederick wanted to buy a unicorn, it would be like buying a car, depending on whether it was a van or a sports car. Buying a winged unicorn was like buying the most advanced fighter jet, and Madame Sophie wouldn't sell a single one. Frederick's hopes were once again dashed, and he could only buy some pack animals to fill the gaps in his territory. The kitchen of the manor had originally prepared a roast pig for Victor, and it was just the right time to entertain Madame Sophie. Madame Sophie still did not take off her veil during dinner, but this did not affect her meal and her telling everyone about her experiences in the East. Richardnell, Katie, and Victor were amazed by the customs and people of the distant land. When dinner was about to end, Psyche, who had been silent all the time, suddenly asked Madame Sophie the name of someone, and it sounded like the surname Weasley. You know him? Madame Sophie was surprised. I've dealt with him before. He's now his country's naval marshal. His Death Star is gradually brightening. He won't be here for many years. He has a daughter, about the same age as Baron Wesson. She grew up at sea and has a promising future. Psyche calmly raised her glass to toast her, thanking her for the news. Madame Sophie spent the entire evening telling stories at the manor. The next day, after purchasing a batch of Wesson's specialties, she left with a fleet. Chapter 57, Here to collect rent. As the weather grew colder, the pace of life slowed. With November approaching, the people of Wessenland had only one thing to do before they could retire for the winter: paying rent and taxes. Like other places, Wessenland collected rent twice a year, at the summer and autumn harvests. In the summer, they collected only grain. In the autumn, they also collected various miscellaneous taxes and supplies like cloth. On weekdays, they collected vegetables, meat, eggs, dairy products, and firewood in turn. Starting on November 1st, Frederick, after arranging all his tasks, went on a tour of the territory with tax collector Neuer to inspect tax collection. Frederick's father, always a daunted man with numbers, had consolidated all of the peasants' taxes, except for the head tax, into a single 30% rent, greatly simplifying the tax official's work. That day, the young master and the tax collector visited one Dow village to inspect the work. At the beginning of the autumn harvest, The tax officials had already selected several plots of land in the village to measure the average yields of oats, barley, and various beans. Then, they calculated the rent based on the number of plots on the lease. Frederick summoned an elderly tax collector, who had been in charge of the surrounding villages for many years, and asked him about the harvest this year. "This autumn harvest is a little worse than last year," the tax collector replied. "With little rain this spring and summer, the oats haven't grown as tall as last year, and the beans haven't been as plentiful." Frederick asked for the figures and mentally calculated that it was about 6% less, barely acceptable. The village's tax collection had remained unchanged for decades and was now carried out in an orderly manner, with no special matters to attend to. Employees of the grain merchants moved among the crowd, asking farmers if they wanted to sell their grain. This year, the price of grain in Wessenland was 10% higher than usual. If it weren't for the Wesson syrup exchange, the market would still have had ample supplies, and the price increase would have been much greater. The rising grain prices, coupled with the influx of disaster victims, were enough to make Frederick flee. Frederick observed the situation for a while, then led his team to inspect a newly built village to the south. "Welcome, headmaster, to Red Mud Pinewood Village." Thomas bowed slightly at the village gate, his angle perfectly adjusted, and with impeccable etiquette, he respectfully greeted the leader as he emerged from the carriage. Frederick nodded slightly, taking advantage of the carriage's height to survey the village's reddish-brown, peaked-roofed houses before dismounting and asking, "Is everyone housed now?" Thomas quickly replied, "Yes. It's not a nice place, but at least they have shelter from the wind and rain." Frederick glanced around, seeing the village deserted except for a few children running by. He asked, "Where are the villagers?" "They're all in the square," Thomas said, pointing behind him. "Sheriff Gaunt is selecting the militia." Frederick nodded and said, "You settle the others first. I'll take a walk around the village." There were about 10 people in several wagons collecting taxes. They were staying here tonight and would collect taxes tomorrow. Frederick had initially planned not to collect taxes from the new villages this year, but this was quickly opposed by the crowd. The reason was simple. Collecting their taxes and registering them meant recognizing them as residents of Wessenland, reassuring these new arrivals. Under this principle, the amount of tax collected could be flexible. Frederick arrived at the village square and saw over 200 strong and young villagers gathered, with the sheriff selecting the militia. Currently, the village had 20 vacancies for the militia, consisting of 10 spearmen, 5 archers, and 5 charioteers, who would use round shields and short swords. These militiamen received 30 days of training each year during the slack season and received subsidies such as tax-free farmland, making them quite attractive. Frederick didn't expect to deploy the militia as a frontline unit. These 20 men would form a logistics and transport team, responsible for transportation during wartime. Sheriff Gaunt, in his 40s, was a stocky, thick-necked man who looked like someone not to be trifled with. He had spent some time with the villagers and could tell at a glance who was suitable and who was not. "Hazienpraz," Gunter yelled, "what are you standing back there for?" Hazienpraz's heart ached. It was true he could wield a spear and a club, no male villager could beat him in a one-on-one fight, but now he'd given up. "Master Gunter," he said aggrievedly, "I'm just a farmer. How can I possibly be a soldier?" Gunter sneered. He had followed his father out of the mountains at the age of 10 to join the mercenary group. A single person's lack of martial arts skills was easily discernible. "You don't have to be one," Gunter said with a strange smile. "Being able to beat me is enough." Hazienpraz's face darkened immediately. An old mercenary like Gunter could easily kill 10 ordinary villagers if he got angry. Whether he could beat them or not was another matter. If he could, what reason was there not to join the militia? If not, wouldn't he just be asking for a beating? Hazienpraz hurriedly shook his head, horrified, saying, "How can I compare to you? You could knock me from the bottom of a mountain to the top with one punch." Seeing this man's reluctance, Gunter gave up and said, "Forget it. Then you won't get any tax cuts or subsidies." Then he looked at a female villager and asked, "Lihal, how about becoming an archer?" Lihal also hurriedly shook her head and said, "Oh, sir, you let me cook? That's fine, but let me shoot. Aren't you afraid I'll shoot one of my own?" Gunter felt helpless seeing her like this, but he couldn't force her, lest anyone think he was abusing his power for personal gain. He had his eyes on a village girl and couldn't afford to tarnish his reputation. Since the 2 best fighters in the village refused to do it, Gunter had to let the stronger and smarter young men take on the job. Many young men were considering saving for marriage, and the militia benefits were a good income, So many signed up. Gunter counted 20 men and notified them to assemble for training the day after tomorrow. After the militia settled in, the villagers quickly dispersed. As the sky grew darker, it was time to prepare for dinner. "Long time no see, Hasenpras," Frederick said, stopping an acquaintance in a deserted alley. Hasenpras was startled, but once he saw who it was, he immediately bowed and greeted, "Baron, I'm glad to see you're still so healthy." Frederick smiled and said, "You look well, not so thin anymore." Hasenpras said respectfully, "All this is a gift from you, my lord." Frederick smiled and said, "I'm just giving you an opportunity. How you live your life from now on is up to you. Come on, take me to see where you live." Chapter 58, I can breathe a sigh of relief. In the last rays of autumn sunlight, a faint wisp of smoke drifted from the rooftop vents. The smoke, like mist, curled across the valley, filling the village with a delicate aroma of pine. Pinewood smoked meats have a unique flavor, especially pheasant from the pine forests, which has a subtle pine aroma and is quite popular in the town. In Hasenplas's house, chicken and sausages hung like grapes on poles dangling from the roof beams above the fire pit. Frederick surveyed the wooden house with curiosity. Unfamiliar with the village's wooden houses, he had assumed they would be difficult to build. Upon asking around, he realized he was wrong. Building a house that met the villagers' requirements was easy. The houses in the village all had the same shape, circular walls 6 or 7 meters in diameter and high, pointed roofs, giving them a fairy tale-like appearance. The construction process was relatively simple. First, a thick wooden stake was stripped of its bark and one end placed over a fire to create a layer of charcoal. This charcoal end, when stuck into the ground, would resist rotting. After these pillars were arranged in a circle, wrist-thick logs were placed in the middle to form walls, reaching about waist-high. Red clay, which was readily available, was mixed with hay to form a slurry, which was applied layer by layer to the walls, providing both a seal and warmth. Next, a dozen or so long logs were built into a pointed point, secured near the top with a circle of wood. This formed the main beam of the roof. Between the main beams, secondary beams were constructed using thinner wood. The roof beams were then waterproofed with a thin layer of wood sheets coated with cheap slime glue, then covered with a thick layer of hay for insulation. A shaped ventilation vent was created at the top, and the roof was complete. The interior was simpler, paved with stones and a pit in the center for the hearth. Furnishing it was a bit more involved. A drainage ditch was dug around the exterior, and a toilet was built, and the work was basically complete. After Hasenplas finished feeding his Amy donkey, he returned home to find Frederick curiously gazing at the magic lamp on the rafters. The lamp was the latest dandelion-shaped one, a bit more expensive than the regular magic lamps, and it illuminated the house brilliantly. Frederick, upon seeing him enter, asked, "Is this new?" Lighting wasn't a pressing issue for the villagers. Cheap oil lamps were sufficient. Hasenpras grew nervous. The master knew his past and worried he'd think he'd been up to those same tricks again. "I've been doing some business," Hasenpras said. "I found some herbs in the mountains, dried them, ground them into powder, and sprinkled them in the stove. The smoke from burning them kills insects in the house. The village chief asked me to make some and sell them to other villages, and I've made a little money. The other day, the village chief and I went to town, and I thought a lamp like this would be handy since I have to take care of the donkey at night, so I bought it. I usually use it myself, and sometimes neighbors borrow it for a night to sew or something." Frederick nodded, and when the porridge in the pot was ready, he told him to start eating. Dinner was a pot of mixed grain porridge made from barley, pea, and chestnut flours, spiced with lard and salt. The taste was indescribable, and now it was the only thing the villagers had. Frederick had brought a few sausages, and Hasenpras grilled 2 and hung the rest. During the meal, Frederick asked, "How are you finding life here?" Hasenpras immediately replied, "Thank you, sir, for your grace. I'm doing well here." Frederick then asked, "How much land did you get?" Hasenpras shook his head and replied, "I didn't ask for much, just some to grow grass for the donkeys. The land here is all red mud, nothing can grow. The village chief said we can just grow some vegetables. There are a lot of pine trees here. We'll plant some in the future. We can make money selling the lumber, rosin, pine oil, and pine nuts." The village chief also said we'll try raising chickens and pigs in the village next spring, and we're also planning to grow mushrooms. Frederick nodded slightly, his opinion of Thomas rising a little. The area south of Wessenland is mostly red soil in limestone mountains, making it difficult to grow crops. The only 2 products are pine and lime. Frederick's latest plan is to build a cement plant next year in a more limestone-rich area slightly north, and then use Archbishop Victor's monastery to gain construction experience. It seems Thomas is doing well, Frederick said. Hazenpraz agreed. The village chief is very smart and knows a lot. He pointed to the smoked meat on the fire pit and continued, the harvest festival is in a few days. The village chief bought chickens early and asked us to make smoked meat. Selling it to the city 2 days before the festival will make more money than usual. If we buy chickens and make smoked meat after the harvest festival, we can sell it before Winter Spirit Festival and make more money than usual. Frederick nodded with satisfaction. The harvest festival here is held every year on November 11th. On this day, the villagers dress up beautifully and parade through the fields with colorful straw figures of cows, horses, pigs, sheep, and other animals to celebrate the year's harvest. The Winter Soul Festival is the winter solstice. After this day, the days get longer and longer. It marks the beginning of the new year for the Church of Light and the biggest festival of the year. Meat is in short supply in the city before the festival, and specialties like pine smoked chicken are even more expensive. Frederick said, then you'll make a lot of money this winter, Hazenpraz said, at least enough to pay off your debts. Frederick frowned and asked, what debts? Whose debts? He had repeatedly prohibited usury and other means of exploiting new residents, and he set a maximum interest rate limit for loans. Now, hearing Hazenpraz talk about debt repayment made him a little sensitive. Hazenpraz pointed at the roof and said, when we first arrived, the village chief took us to the city to find a man named O. He bought us a few small water wheels and saws on credit. Otherwise, we couldn't build our houses so quickly. He also found a friend named Ba. He bought us a lot of white things on credit. If you melt them and apply them to wood chips, they'll be waterproof, so they can be used to make roofs leak-proof. It cost a lot of money. Now our village has to sell wood and bacon to pay it back. Frederick quietly finished the last bit of porridge in his bowl, thinking it was a good idea. Every village has limited construction funds, only able to meet minimum standards. Therefore, they can raise funds by selling excess wood cut during land reclamation. Thomas simply used his connections at Wittenberg University to buy on credit and repay over time. The additional method of repaying the debt by selling bacon did not violate any regulations. Frederick put down his empty bowl and asked, do you have enough winter clothes? Now, everyone in the village, except Thomas and Gunter, who wore their own clothes, was issued clothing, 2 sets of tight shorts, a short-sleeved t-shirt, and thick socks, along with long pants, a long-sleeved t-shirt, a padded vest, a jacket, and a military coat, along with a pair of slam-like rubber shoes. Because the fabric was sourced from various sources, the colors varied. Only the military coats were made of the inexpensive blue fabric. I've never had such good winter clothes before, Hazenpraz said as he took his own military coat out of the box. Frederick examined it and found it was of acceptable thickness and weight. Seeing that they had enough food, clothing, and shelter, Frederick breathed a sigh of relief. Chapter 59. A promising person. In the village nestled in the pine forest, thin smoke from cooking fires still lingered in the morning. After a brief period of excitement, calm quickly returned. Tax officials announced the village's tax policy. Every tax category must be paid, but each tax required a single piece of firewood, knee-high, of any thickness. The symbolic tax relieved the villagers, and they each took their tools and headed up the mountain to chop wood. Thomas found Frederick feeding his donkey near Hazenpraz's house. The donkey, Ami, was a female, recently reached adulthood. Hazenpraz had built a small shed for her using branches and red mud, tying her to a stump outside for daily roaming. Frederick placed some fresh carrots and dried bean vines on the ground and drew water from the well into a nearby trough. The donkey immediately came over to eat. Unlike cattle and sheep, donkeys only have one stomach, so they prefer crispy foods. Soft, fiber-rich foods like wheat straw can easily cause intestinal obstruction. Moreover, donkeys have small stomachs and can't be fed too much at once, as it would upset their stomachs. They can only eat 3 meals a day. Taro stood by and watched quietly, as if a young master was feeding his pet. When Thomas approached, he saw Frederick stroking the donkey's ears and saying, "Those ears look like rabbits." The donkey bit Frederick's finger, causing real damage. Frederick and Thomas reached the highest hilltop nearby, offering a bird's eye view of the village and the surrounding terrain. Thomas laid out his development plan, essentially the same as what Hazenpraz had outlined yesterday, but in greater detail. "These pine trees are a precious treasure," Thomas said, gazing at the bare pine forest from the hilltop. Principal, I have a suggestion. Unify all the pine forests here. Frederick found a stump and sat down, resting his right hand on his knee and his chin in his hand. Tell me what you think, he asked. He sensed Thomas's thoughts echoed his own. Pine wood is highly useful in construction, carpentry, furniture, posts, mining pillars, sleepers, and papermaking. Rosin can be refined into rosin and turpentine. Rosin is currently used in soaps, paints, construction, musical instrument maintenance, and post-slaughter livestock depilation. Turpentine is used in painting, varnish, and medicine, and future demand is expected to be substantial. If there were no restrictions on felling, no matter how many trees there were, there wouldn't be enough to chop down. Thomas cleared his throat and found a nearby pine tree. This pine tree is about the same age as the principal. Its trunk isn't thick enough yet, so it needs many more years to grow. It won't be ready until it's 20 years old. If we cut down all the large and small trees in the next few years, there won't be any new pine trees left to chop down. My idea is to divide the pine forest into 20 sections, and chop down one section each year. That way, we don't have to worry about running out of pine trees in the future. Frederick tried to recall a conversation he'd had with a relative at Gaofang Forest Farm over lemon duck in his previous life, when he'd heard his relative's co-worker, a veteran employee at the forest farm, talk about pine trees. He hesitated for a moment. Thomas, believing the principal was still young and lacked a grasp of long-term planning, gathered a bunch of pine needles and stuck them in the ground to demonstrate. Frederick recalled something and waited until he finished before saying, I once heard a wandering scholar tell me about a family in his hometown who conducted an experiment. On one mountain, the pine trees start harvesting their resin at 13, and at 23, they're cut down and sold. On another mountain, the pine trees start harvesting their resin at 20, and at 30, they're cut down and sold. Which do you think is more profitable? Thomas's expression suddenly grew serious. Legends circulated throughout Wessenland University about the wandering scholar, who had taught the president many things, microscopy, steelmaking, and medicine, though no one knew what else. He pondered for a long time before finally saying, I think the mountain where the trees are harvested at 30 will be more profitable. With an extra decade, the trees can grow thicker and fetch a higher price. Thicker trees also mean more resin. Frederick nodded in satisfaction. The pine trees harvested at 20 years old yielded 50% more resin than those harvested at 13, with less impact on their growth and higher economic returns. He felt even more satisfied with Thomas, so he asked, would you be interested in getting an extra salary? A flash of surprise and excitement crossed Thomas's face, and he immediately stood at attention, shouting solemnly, thank you, Principal, for your training. Frederick stroked his hair and then said, make a plan first. Travel more, see more, ask more questions, think more, and use more numbers to speak. Whether you can get a second salary depends on your ability. Don't slack off in your work as village chief. I'll deal with you if anything goes wrong. By the way, what are you studying? Thomas replied immediately, Principal, I'm studying painting. Because buying paint is expensive, I plan to find a job to save some money. I'll go back to school when I have enough. Frederick hurriedly said, don't worry about your studies. I'm planning to set up a correspondence course at the university, targeting students like you and BASF who don't have time to go back to school. Your student status will remain intact. Don't worry about being expelled. Wait for details. He had only just thought of the correspondence course. In line with the principle of not giving up on any student, especially art students, it was important to provide convenience for those unable to study full-time. Thomas immediately exclaimed happily, that's fantastic. Many people share my sentiment. They hadn't starved after fleeing here from Constantinople, but without a source of income, many students were struggling. There were examples of people making money at the university, but not everyone could do so. Besides magic, the university also had many students studying art, literature, and law, and Wesson County wouldn't have many jobs for them for a while. For those like Thomas, who couldn't even afford paint, selling their paintings was impossible. Frederick said to him, tell them to go for it. Both their studies and their careers are promising. Our Wesson County will upgrade 4 cities next year and expand the military, leaving many positions vacant. Some of these positions will be promoted from existing employees, and they'll only be the most basic jobs. Interested individuals can start from the bottom, like you. My territory will definitely be much larger than this. Don't you understand? How could Thomas not understand? Many students' future careers lie in working for the nobility, and political acumen is essential. The best job for a painter like Thomas is to find a noble as an investor or be hired as a family painter. Once involved in this circle, one must be able to read the winds, or at least know when to run. Everyone is familiar with the conflict between the Wesson family and the king, and the inner workings of the royal family have been well informed. King William is now elderly, his heir Rudolph is a weakling, and Frederick's current performance is impressive, and most importantly, he is incredibly young. If Frederick outlasts the king, it will be time for retribution. Without waiting for Thomas to respond, Frederick continued, "Take good notes. Record your thoughts on each task, the problems you encountered, how you handled them, and the results. Summarize them for future use." Thomas immediately agreed. Frederick then discussed the village's difficulties with him, and then drifted into a conversation about everything else. Chapter 60 The Beginning of a Miracle. The annual work conference of Wessenland was held in the city of Wessenberg on December 20th. Baron Friedrich von Wesson, Lord of Wessenland, attended the meeting and delivered an important speech. Family Knight Franz the Elder, Administrator Frank, Tax Collector Neuer, Judge Otto, Medical Officer Frank, and Vice President Manuel of the University of Wessenberg were also in attendance. In his important speech, Baron Wesson summarized the work of 1024, analyzed the current situation facing Wessenland, and laid out plans for 1025. The conference recognized this year as a crucial one in the history of Wessenland. We have overcome the grief of losing loved ones in war and blocked the dagger stabbing from the shadows. Faced with a turbulent external environment and the arduous task of maintaining internal stability, under the strong leadership of Baron Wesson, the people rose to the challenge, forged ahead, and coordinated efforts to establish the University of Wessenberg, develop new villages, and properly resettle 65,535 relocated residents. Construction of the Carolina Canal officially began, and a number of high-tech industries emerged. Commerce flourished, prices remained generally stable, and food security and people's livelihoods were effectively guaranteed, maintaining overall social stability. These achievements were hard-earned and deserve to be cherished. The meeting noted that the current foundation for the development of Wesson territory is not yet solid, and pressures remain significant in maintaining the stability of the newly relocated residents, ensuring food security, and defending the territory. The adverse external environment poses potential risks to the territory's development. However, we must recognize that our economy is resilient, has great potential, and is vibrant. New industries continue to generate revenue, and overall economic growth is expected to increase next year. We must firmly maintain our confidence in doing a good job in economic work. The meeting emphasized that to achieve success next year, we must adhere to the general principle of seeking progress while maintaining stability, properly demarcate administrative regions, ensure food security and the supply of industrial raw materials, strengthen military development, vigorously develop healthcare, education and training, and arts and sports, improve legal frameworks for employment and wage guarantees in commerce and industry, and adjust tax policies to promote industrial and commercial development and expand domestic demand, thus making a good start in the comprehensive development of Wessenland. The day after the meeting, Frederick visited Frank's office in the executive yuan. Frank sat at his desk, still a bit dazed. He had originally wanted to be a doctor to a nobleman, but now he had become an official. "How is the office?" Frederick asked with a smile upon entering. "Anything that's not suitable can be modified." Frank immediately stood to greet his leader. Frederick sat down with him on the sofa, asked Harrow to make tea, and asked, "Have you settled down at home?" Frank replied, "I found a place to live. But the owner is still hanging on the city wall, so no one dared to buy it. In the end, it was sold to me." Frederick nodded gently. Last month, while he was chatting with Thomas, a tax official reported that a newly distributed village had been ordered by the village chief to remove the cotton from its distributed cotton coats. The chief then sold the cotton along with half the village's donkeys and their carts. Frederick immediately summoned Jurgen and his men, who led troops to surround the village, and the chief quickly confessed. The chief came from a family of urban grocers. His brothers, skilled in writing and arithmetic, had become chiefs, and once they had secured their positions, they began reselling goods, not just cotton and donkeys, but also tools and rations. Ultimately, the offending members of the family were placed in iron cages, first hung from a cart and paraded around the territory, and then hung from the city walls. Their families were forced to sell their possessions and flee. Frederick came here on business. He took a sip from his teacup and said, "I was busy with other things before, so today I have the chance to talk to you about work. Last month, I visited the village to inspect tax collection, and I heard some things about medical care. As you know, doctors are very rare due to their specializations. They are only found in cities and towns. Farmers in the village have to go to the city to see a doctor when they fall ill. Many die from acute illnesses, and some are busy with farm work when they fall ill, and by the time they are not working, they are already seriously ill and difficult to treat. I have a plan. I want you to preside over the compilation of a medical book. This book won't cover complex illnesses, but will focus on the diagnosis and inexpensive treatment of common diseases. For pharmacy, you can go to Wessenland University and see Professor Friedrich. He is currently dedicated to researching cheap and effective drugs. The book uses simple and easy-to-understand language, so even a literate farmer can understand it and prescribe the right medicine. Then I plan to open a training course. I will select a smart young person from each village to give them a short-term training. As long as they can use this book to diagnose common diseases, it will be enough. This book, combined with Professor Friedrich's inexpensive medicinal herbs, will allow many patients in the village to receive timely treatment. Besides doctors, we also plan to train midwives in this way." Frank stood there, teacup in hand, stunned. The existence of barefoot doctors was 2 generations ahead of him, and for a moment, he found it difficult to comprehend. Frederick had long wanted to promote barefoot doctors, but there were some prerequisites. Without papermaking and printing, it would be impossible to mass-produce relevant manuals. Without ready-made medicines, these amateur doctors would have to expend considerable effort studying pharmacy, which increased the cost of their training. Now that these conditions were in place, he had begun this work. Frank pondered for a long time, then put down his teacup. "This isn't something I can do alone. I specialize in internal medicine and obstetrics, but the rest will require the help of other experienced doctors. I think this is a very meaningful project. I can write to the professors and students at the medical school and invite them to work on it together." Frederick thought for a moment and asked, "There's no medical school at the University of Wessenland right now. I wonder if you could invite an authority to open one here, so that they could teach and also write this medical book. I plan to fund the University of Wessenland to compile an encyclopedia. There's no medical encyclopedia yet, so I plan to fund you to lead the effort by inviting doctors to write the medical section." He then pulled a piece of rough linen paper from his pocket and, as before, printed a few watermarks on the bottom of the teacup before handing it over. "We in Wessenland are researching a new medium for writing," he said proudly. "Once we succeed, we can print cheap books in large quantities." Frank was also stunned. The concept of an encyclopedia has been around for a long time. Some have attempted to compile their own, but due to personal financial resources, abilities, and lifespan limitations, only small-scale encyclopedias have been produced. It wasn't that no one had considered seeking financial support from the nobility, but in an era when handwritten books were expensive, an encyclopedia was merely a decorative item. Furthermore, the investment was substantial and it lacked the luxury of prudence, so no wealthy individual was interested. If an encyclopedia were truly mass-produced, Frank understood the significance of having his name on it as a scholar. Frederick smiled at Frank. This expression wasn't new to him. He'd seen the same reaction the other day when he'd discussed this project with Manuel, even trembling and blushing. After more than 10 minutes, Frederick left the office, feeling satisfied. Frank had already ignored him, muttering about writing letters to those people. Chapter 61 Snow Training. In a silent world, dancing and descending, Frederick hummed, brandishing his wooden training sword across the thick snow, slashing and stabbing the snowflakes in the wind. Small orbs of magical elements danced around the blade. Every year from mid-December to January, Wessenland and the surrounding areas experience heavy snowfall, freezing rivers for 30 to 40 days. During this time, farmers stay indoors, while city dwellers leave only to buy food or go to the bar. Even government offices are in a state of semi-rest. Yet, many people remain busy during the winter. Frederick continued his daily studies, but Professor Walter, who taught grammar, rhetoric, and logic, had caught a cold and now shivered on his newly built kang, sipping warm ginger wine with a hot water bottle. His lessons were replaced by Psyche's magic lessons. Psyche hadn't taught Frederick much magic in her formal classes, aside from the simple spells used in magical theory and how to control magical elements in complex magical environments. Today, Psyche challenged him to talk, strike snowflakes with his sword, and control the magical elemental spheres circling the sword, while also dodging snowballs flying from his peripheral vision. This seemingly simple exercise was actually quite challenging, primarily due to the need to maintain a constant positional relationship between the elemental spheres and the constantly moving sword. Humans rely on mental power to control magical elements. Simply controlling the elemental spheres in conjunction with the sword requires two simultaneous calculations, the sword's position and the sphere's trajectory, a feat not normally accomplished. Therefore, Psyche taught Frederick a method, infusing his mental power into the sword, using it as a point of origin to control the elemental spheres. This feeling was novel to Frederick. His mental power was like an invisible hand. Without this method, it was like controlling the sword with his right hand and the elemental spheres with his left. Using this method, it was as if the arm holding the sword extended, the sword becoming a third arm, whose fingers could pass through and control the elemental spheres. Simultaneously, when the sword, imbued with mental power, touched the snowflakes, he felt as if his body were touching the snow. After a half-hour training session, Frederick was drenched in sweat. He stood there panting, puffs of white mist drifting across the snow. Taro immediately emerged from a nearby shed and shoved a cotton towel down Frederick's neck, wiping away the sweat. He then wiped his steaming head, then his face, and finally placed a fresh cotton towel against his back. Frederick returned to the shed, put on his coat, sat on a mat, and took a long sip of his hot ginger tea. Psyche sat beside him, a steaming cup of tea in one hand and a book she brought from Constantinople in the other. As she read, she asked him, "How does it feel?" "Very novel," Frederick replied. "When I infuse my spiritual energy into the sword, it becomes like an extension of my body, with a sense of touch." "Does it work the same way with other things?" Psyche gestured with her chin to a hole leaning against the wall. "Try it." "Hoe the ground." Frederick shook his head hastily. The lettuce in the greenhouse had been harvested. Some was consumed internally by the Wessenland High Command, a small portion was tied with silk and sold at auction to merchants, and the rest was packed into baskets, wrapped in quilts to prevent freezing, and quickly delivered to Maria. The ground had been composted and tilled a few days ago, and the seeds had been sown yesterday. Now, every hole was turning the soil into compost. "Let's try a different one," Frederick said. "I'll try the cup." He tried to channel his mental power into the cup and immediately felt the temperature, liquid texture, and even a hint of flavor. "I can actually sense what's inside the cup," he exclaimed in surprise. Psyche looked up and said, "Because mental power is a part of you, an extension of your body." Frederick thought for a moment and asked, "So, if I radiate my mental power around me, I can detect everything around me and avoid being attacked?" Psyche nodded nonchalantly, saying, "Theoretically, I could even ignore the girl's clothes." Frederick blinked, bewildered. There was actually such a thing? "But be prepared for a beating," Psyche continued. "When your mental power touches others, they'll react." Frederick didn't react in any way. He wasn't a hooligan, he wouldn't do such a thing. He asked, "Is it possible to detect only nearby objects without being noticed?" "This would prevent sneak attacks from unscrupulous individuals," Psyche simply replied. "Then give it a try." Some consider mental power a sixth sense. Seeing she didn't object, Frederick attempted to direct his mental power around him, but he felt nothing special. He simply sensed the abundant ice and water elements, along with smaller amounts of other magical elements, as usual. Puzzled, he paused his mental power and decided to drink his tea before asking. The tea was already cold, so he formed a small fireball from his fingertips and flicked it into the cup to heat it. Frederick took a sip and found the tea wasn't quite the temperature he'd expected. It was just warm, not quite cold, not quite what he'd hoped for. He thought it was uneven heating, so he shook the cup to distribute the tea more evenly. He took a sip and found the temperature was still the same. Strange, Frederick's mind was filled with questions. Could it be that I'm too tired, so the fireball's power has decreased? No, the total amount and speed of the fire element are the same. Psyche raised an eyebrow and agreed. Yes, what's going on? An idea flashed through Frederick's mind, and he immediately asked her, "Does the power of the fire element decrease in winter?" He had never used the fire element in winter before, and this was the first time he had noticed this phenomenon. Psyche simply replied, "Since you have such an idea, let's find a way to conduct an experiment to verify your hypothesis." Frederick nodded. Her words proved that this experiment was valuable and meaningful. After the break, he took off his coat and went outside to continue his training in the snow. Frederick thought for a moment, then released his mental energy to surround himself, devoting some of his attention to the falling snowflakes. When he began to tire, Psyche stamped her feet in the greenhouse, and fist-sized snowballs emerged from the snow outside. The snowball flew silently, darting past Frederick's blind spot, toward the back of his neck. "Oh, I'll catch a cold this way," Taro grumbled at Psyche, pouting and muttering to herself that she was adding to his workload. Frederick suddenly felt his mental power react, as if a surge of ice elements were approaching. Turning back, he was met with a snowball's blast. He froze, wondering if this method could at least detect the magic around him. Suddenly, he ducked, and another snowball flew silently over his head. For the next moment, Frederick's back became the target of all the snowballs. Countless more flew towards him, even turning around, out of sight. Frederick had to concentrate his entire attention, constantly turning backwards, dodging or intercepting them with his sword. He was soon exhausted and breathless. Training concluded, Taro rushed over to wipe his sweat and took him to the greenhouse for a cup of warm ginger tea. "Master, you are such a fool," Taro said, "since those snowballs are flying from behind you, why don't you just lie down?" Frederick was silent. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 62 Something Thought. After the morning classes, as everyone walked back to the manor house, Frederick asked Taro, "I heard you guys have invested in a new industry together." "Yes," Taro replied, "we've discussed it with Professor BASF, and he's helping us design a factory to make buttons out of slime glue." A bit surprised, Frederick said, "Buttons? We'll have no trouble selling them." Frederick might not have much extra money now, but Taro and other high-ranking officials and former knights in Wessenland still had considerable wealth. Guiding them to invest in new industries would be a win-win situation. The economic base determines the superstructure, and emerging industries fostering new vested interests and forming new groups would benefit Frederick's control over the territory. The slime glue industry has currently received the most investment. BASF has decided to retain only raw material production, processing and selling all other products to others. Frederick heard that the investors had already divided up their own territories, including rubber shoes, rain gear, tableware, toys, tires, and daily necessities. He was surprised to learn that Taro and the other girls had already started their own button business. In contrast, no one wanted to invest in heavy industry because the investment was too high, the profit cycle was too long, and the market size seemed smaller. It couldn't compare to the slime glue industry, which required less investment, had quick returns, and a completely blank market. Along the way, Taro enthusiastically discussed their business ambitions. Buttons currently made of wood, metal, and bone are difficult to process, especially complex patterns. But slime glue, on the other hand, is different. It can be easily pressed into a mold. There are as many people wearing clothes as there are people buying buttons. Cheap buttons, at least in places with waterways, are readily available. As they prepared to return to the house, Taro went ahead to get Frederick some hot water to wash himself. Frederick turned to Psyche and asked, "Aren't you planning to start a business and earn some money?" Psyche shook her head and said, "No, I have enough." Curious, Frederick asked, "How many gold coins do you have?" Psyche counted on her fingers, then held up 40,000. Frederick nearly jumped in surprise. Psyche shook her head and said, "How is that possible?" "Oh," Frederick pushed open the door of the fence of the house. 4,000, you must be kidding." Psyche shook her head and shook off a few snowflakes on her brown bangs. "Just 40 coins, she said while shaking the snowflakes off her fur hat. "I buried them in several places and dug them out when needed. I only carry some change with me." Frederick several times before saying, "It's a lot less than I expected. I thought you would have a lot of money. Why do you need so much money?" Psyche glanced at him. "It's so heavy. It's troublesome. It's enough for us." Frederick curled his lips and said, "I thought you had a golden castle somewhere." "Forget it," Psyche said. "If the castle was so comfortable to live in, you wouldn't have to come here for the winter. I'm destined to travel around. I won't stay in one place for a long time." Frederick asked her puzzledly, "Are you traveling or looking for something?" Psyche was silent for a moment and replied, "A slime." Frederick had already walked to the door of the room. He turned around and asked in surprise, "What kind of slime?" the kind that is 8 feet tall and 8 feet around the waist. Taro was already waiting there. After opening the door, he helped him remove his snow-stained coat and sweater, shaking them clean before hanging them on the coat rack by the door. Psyche didn't answer, but simply took off her fur coat, shook it clean, and hung it on the coat rack along with her hat. Frederick didn't ask any more questions and followed Taro to the bathroom, where the hot tub was already warm. After a sweaty workout in the cold weather, a bath was perfect, and Frederick lay in the tub, feeling a little sleepy. Taro was in the adjoining kitchen, preparing lunch. Katie was there too. She had made a stew of cabbage, sweetened by the snow, onions, celery, carrots, and peppers, along with pork skin, feet, ribs, and other parts of the pig, perfect for winter. They were chatting in the kitchen, discussing whether they should bring another bucket of hot water to the adjoining bathroom when a shout came from the other side. "I've got it." Frederick suddenly jumped out of the tub, completely undressed, ran to the bathroom door, opened it, and headed for the study. But the cold breeze outside sent him scurrying back into the warm tub. At lunchtime, Katie curiously asked Frederick, "What did you think of just now?" Frederick, buried in his lunch, simply mumbled, "Nothing." When he finished his plate of stew, Katie scooped him another, saying, "Then eat more. Your brain will have more energy to think about more things." Frederick nodded and took another bowl. After he finished his second, Psyche, with a playful look on her face, filled him with a third and asked, "What did you think of? Did you discover buoyancy?" Frederick shook his head, took the bowl, and said, "Nothing. I just thought of a way to measure the reduced power of the fire element you were talking about, but there are still a lot of problems. We need to start from scratch with all the tools." Psyche nodded and said, "Keep going." Then, Frederick, feeling very full from lunch, lay on the sofa in his study, sorting out his previous conjectures and optimizing his upcoming experiments. At the same time, he discovered he'd overlooked many issues. There were many useful things the world hadn't yet invented, and if they were, they would become several new products. After briefly reflecting on the structures of certain objects, he went to his desk to prepare his drawings. The ink had frozen this morning, and Taro had just helped him light the small charcoal stove on his desk. Hot water was warming on the stove, and the ink bottle was placed in the water to thaw. Frederick soon encountered a new problem. Some things that didn't exist seemed simple to make, but actually creating them required working backwards from the process to derive the tools, a massive undertaking. Time slipped by unnoticed, and the winter nights arrived early. Even before dinner time, the words on the paper were already blurry. Then, the magic lamp on the desk lit up. Katie turned it on for him and placed a cup of warm milk on the table. "Drink something to warm your stomach first," she said. "We'll have the fish father caught tonight, so we won't be eating until later. You should fill your stomach first." Frederick picked up the cup and said curtly, "Thank you, sister." Katie reached out and poked his head, complaining, "You didn't drink any water all afternoon. Be careful not to get stones in your body." Frederick shrank his neck and promised on the spot to drink water on time in the future. Chapter 63 Asking if I can make money. The snow stopped, the wind died down, and the clouds vanished, leaving the earth a blanket of white. At daybreak, the men of the estate began clearing the snow, first from the vegetable greenhouses and then from their own houses. As daylight faded, the elderly and women, along with their children, tended to the vegetables in the greenhouses while the men departed in their carriages. Workshops were being built all over the area outside Wessenland. Since they were idle in the winter, they could work there, earning some money and getting a few free steamed buns for lunch. If they saved a steamed bun ticket for lunch, they could collect it and take it home in their bags at the end of the day. The men gathered in the carriages, discussing what to buy before Winter Sowl Festival. Many decided on rubber boots, which were waterproof and convenient for working in the fields. Some suggested buying raincoats, which were light and comfortable. Still others planned to buy a set of tableware as a gift for marriage proposals. One of the carriages was filled with young people, and one suggested they all pool their money to buy a football and play it when they had free time. Everyone agreed, and thus the future soccer powerhouse team, the Greenhouse team, was formed. The convoy arrived at its destination, an open field where workers from all directions disembarked, creating a bustling atmosphere. Some were long-term workers, either finding their foreman or heading to the work sites themselves. Foremen seeking short-term labor were clamoring for work, asking for digging and moving. The wages were 10 coppers, with 4 steamed buns for lunch, paid daily. Frederick and Richardnell also disembarked, one to the blacksmith's shop, the other to ice cut and fish in the river. Taro was taking a day off, and Frederick was followed by his head maid, Carpo. On the way, Frederick asked her, "When were you kidnapped?" Carpo blushed slightly and replied, "It was agreed to be next spring." Frederick chuckled, "Oh," and jokingly said, "That year, I thought you'd go with him." "I heard you had all your belongings ready." Carpo quickly defended herself, "That's impossible. Master was still young then, so I must be remembering it wrong." Frederick looked at the clear blue sky and said nonchalantly, "Perhaps. I just remember one day my mother and I were blocking the corridor. I don't remember if it was to stop passers-by from kissing or disturbing someone." Carpo was stunned, her face flushing crimson. She instinctively raised her fist, trying to make her forget something. Frederick turned around and saw her rolling up her sleeves. He ran as fast as he could. The late wife's will gave Carpo the power to beat Frederick. The blacksmith shop was bustling as usual, but the clatter of ironwork was mingled with the sounds of curses. With the funds secured from Archbishop Victor already in hand, heavy industry began to accelerate. A new smelter north of Wessenland was under construction under Alfred's supervision. It was significantly larger than the current site and would feature a reverberatory furnace. The lakeside forge, overseen by Bryant, was also under intense construction. With the help of blacksmiths from the disaster victims, it was expected to begin production next year. The bearing factory was also spun off to specialize in bearing production. Almut proposed the management of one of his students, and Frederick agreed in principle. The blacksmith shop, while maintaining its original steel and bearing production, also served as a training ground for new hires, who would be able to start work immediately upon completion. It also became Professor Almut's laboratory, where he and his students spent their days researching reciprocating machines. When Frederick arrived, a group of people were testing a machine. Since they were all familiar with each other, he squeezed in beside Almut to see what new tricks they had come up with. There were indeed new features. Previous magic muscles had heat dissipation issues, but this machine's magic muscles had been transformed from a round shape to shape, increasing surface area and improving heat dissipation. It also featured two circular plates mounted on the front and back, separated by a circle of elastic, wavy slime, somewhat like an accordion. Water inlets and outlets were located on the front and back plates, allowing water to flow through for cooling. The inlet pipe connected to a large wooden barrel high above, filled with an ice-water mixture. The outlet pipe led to a wooden barrel. Frederick reached into the barrel and found it was slightly warm. "Looks good," Frederick said. Almut nodded and replied, "Just connect a fist-sized reciprocating pump to the side for water cooling, and we can sell it. BASF can easily make one." Frederick took a look and saw that the entire structure, not including the water cooling system, was about the size of a microwave oven, easily enough to power a mill and forging hammer. "Can it be made bigger?" he asked. "Can it replace the water wheel?" Almut replied, "Of course, it can, but the cooling equipment will be even larger." Someone then suggested, "How about using indirect magical cooling? The water in contact with the magic muscles would have a separate circuit. They dissipate heat through pipes in a magically cooled water tank. Those pipes would be coated with a high magic resistance metal to prevent magical elements from entering." Frederick looked up and saw it was Diesel, the explosive genius, whom he hadn't noticed. Almut thought for a moment, then nodded. "That's a good idea, but there's a limit. If the temperature exceeds the boiling point of water, it's going to be difficult." Frederick agreed. Once the water boiled, it would become a pressure cooker. The surrounding soft rubber would be inflated into a ball. Using cooling oil instead, the excessive heat would melt the soft rubber. Diesel said, "Then let's explore its potential. The boss and I are still waiting for the boring machine to come in and make the pipes." Almut joked, "Then I'd have to put your hand under the water outlet and tell us if it's about to boil. That way we can know where the limit is." Diesel rolled his eyes. Back then, there was no unified temperature scale. Many people had established their own, but none was universally accepted. The only universally recognized standard was the freezing point of distilled water. Thermometer development was also in its infancy. While there were liquid-based thermometers, they didn't account for the effects of atmospheric pressure. Many were still open-ended, and those that were closed didn't have a vacuum. Almut's suggestion of measuring the water's temperature with his hand wasn't a joke. Some people actually did it. Frederick had come this time for this very purpose. The best way to study whether the element of fire is weaker in winter is to measure the temperature rise when the same amount of fire heats the same volume of water. This requires a precise temperature scale and thermometer. He had a plan ready, and today he was going to Almet to see if any of his skilled craftsmen could handle it. I have a new idea. As soon as Frederick finished speaking, All Might and Diesel asked in unison, can it make money? Chapter 64. The principal is going to teach people how to make money again. If you ask a magician why they learn magic, over 90% will answer money. The rest will say they want to earn a lot of money to explore the path of magic. Those who pursue magic out of love are wealthy families with plenty of money. In the past, magicians had limited means of making money. They could either rely on force to become part of the landlord class, create mysterious artifacts and sell them to the wealthy, or simply exploit their peers. Now, in Western territory, everyone has a new option. They can earn money from ordinary people. Everyone at Wessenberg University now agrees that despite the president's young age, he's a genius at making money with magic. Vice President Manuel, after years of studying necromancy, didn't make much money. Under the president's guidance, he switched to long-term food preservation and has made some progress. Once he solves the problem of why some dehydrated, sealed condensed soups spoil over time while others don't, he'll be showered with gold. And then there's that guy from BASF, who not long ago was struggling to find money for his wedding. Now, thanks to the president's guidance, his income and the number of wives he can afford depends on his kidneys. Now that the principal had a new idea, everyone was immediately excited. Frederick noticed their eyes were green, like hungry wolves looking at lambs. Ahem, he coughed twice. I'm asking, is there anyone who can expel the air from an object, creating a vacuum? Suddenly, an older woman shouted, my fiancé is the best at this. Principal, wait. I'll get him. Frederick blinked, and the older woman had already run to the blacksmith stable, pulling out her horse to look for someone. The other sighed, as if they were seeing a mountain of gold disappearing from their grasp. Okay, let's talk about something else first. Frederick shrugged. Let me talk about another type of thermometer. Everyone knows about thermal expansion and contraction, and we also know that different metals deform differently under the same temperature change. We can press two thin sheets of metal together tightly. When they deform due to the temperature change, one side deforms more and the other less, and the metal will bend. We can use this bending deformation to detect temperature. There's no need to worry about it failing due to boiling, like water does. It can measure very hot objects, as long as they're not red hot. He was talking about the principle of a bimetallic thermometer. This one was not difficult, the main problem being the craftsmanship. A small amount can be produced by hand, which is sufficient for now. Everyone looked at each other and nodded. Frederick was ready. He gestured to Carpo, and the head maid immediately pulled out a piece of parchment with a number written in the corner from her shoulder bag. He handed the parchment to All Might, and several people immediately crowded over to examine it. All Might simply placed the parchment on a table, and everyone gathered around to study it. The scholars studying golem puppets all had backgrounds in metallurgy and machining, and they immediately understood the principle behind this mushroom-like bimetallic thermometer. The thermometer's core was a long, spiral-shaped thermal sensor made of two metal sheets. When the temperature changed, the tip of the thermometer rotated, moving the needle. After everyone observed it for a while, a student said, Principal, if this metal spiral were flat, it could be made the size of a palm, suitable for measuring temperatures in a room. If it were smaller, it could fit in a pocket, right? After a moment, no one responded, and they realized Frederick had been squeezed out. Everyone awkwardly shoved together, making room. Frederick walked over and said, if you think it's feasible, give it a try. The student excitedly replied, okay, I'll make it. There was still a sizable market for thermometers, if not for wealth, at least a comfortable life. Then someone poured cold water on their expectations. What temperature scale are you going to use? The student frowned in annoyance, clearly not the first time he'd encountered this question. Frederick said, that's all right. We'll use our own temperature scale. Just then, the sound of horse hooves echoed, followed by shouts. Here they come. Principal, they're here. The older woman from earlier hurried in, dragging a handsome young man along with her. The young man, also beaming with excitement, immediately greeted the principal and introduced himself upon entering the blacksmith's shop. Duval. Frederick raised an eyebrow. I remember there was a big man with the same surname on the island of England. Duval politely replied, I'm just a side branch of the family. I only have a knighthood and an estate. I don't want to farm all my life. I went away to study at the age of 12 and never went back, Frederick said. Oh, and said, Selling wool over there is quite profitable, Duval replied sincerely. Who would dare to say they can make money in front of the principal? Frederick just smiled and asked, where were you just now? How did you get here so quickly? Duval replied, I'm at BASF, researching the pressure cooker invented by the principal. I discovered that the boiling point of water is related to air pressure. Today I'm trying to see if water can boil at a lower temperature under low pressure. Frederick said, of course you can. If you don't believe me, go to the top of a mountain. If the water boils, you won't be able to cook the meat properly. By the way, can you control the air pressure? Duval didn't think about the boiling point. Making money was more important, so he immediately replied, yes, I'm good at wind magic. I can create a vacuum to kill the enemy, or I can create high pressure to cause some trouble for people. Frederick's mouth twitched, and he said, who can withstand your skills on the battlefield? Duval shook his head and said, I don't like killing, and there are many ways to crack this method. It won't work if the wind is strong. Frederick nodded and said, then use this magic to make money. Duval immediately stood at attention and answered loudly, thank you, principal, for your cultivation. Frederick touched his hair, asked Carpo to bring another piece of parchment, put it on the table, and said, let's start from the beginning and talk about the thermometer. To make a thermometer, you must first confirm the temperature scale. 0 degrees is set at the freezing point of water, which is very commonly used. 100 degrees is set at the boiling point of water under a pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury column. After he finished speaking, someone asked, why do you have to be so sure? Duval responded immediately, the boiling point of water is related to air pressure. That's for sure. At a given pressure, the boiling point of water remains constant. So using that to determine 100 degrees makes perfect sense. The air pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury is neither too high nor too low, about the same as at the seaside, within that range, so it's rounded up perfectly. His explanation sounded reasonable, and no one objected. The student who had just proposed making a bimetallic thermometer said, okay, then, let's make a thermometer based on this scale and call it the Wessenland degree. Everyone nodded in agreement. Frederick didn't care, this one thing wouldn't make a difference. He placed another piece of parchment on the table and said, we just talked about bimetallic thermometers. Now let's talk about liquid thermometers. Liquid thermometers work on the same principle as existing thermometers, but they're vacuum-free, eliminating errors caused by air pressure. Duval said, I can use a magic circle to create a vacuum zone. To seal it, Professor All Might can design a special golem puppet arm. All Might said, that's easy. Wagner can do it. Talk to her. Duval's fiancée chuckled triumphantly. Frederick continued, our glass workshop won't start construction until next year. There's no rush, but you can make something new and make money now. Another piece of parchment appeared on the table. Temperature is transmitted through objects, and a vacuum can effectively isolate the transmission of temperature. He pointed to the cross-section of a thermos cup on the parchment and said, you can start by making this kind of cup and kettle. There's a vacuum between the two metal shells, leaving a small tail to heat and seal in a vacuum environment. You can figure out the lid yourself, it'll be fine. Duval's eyes lit up. This thing is great. It's so cold now, and if there's a cup like this to hold hot water, it will definitely keep it warm for a long time. Frederick finally said, my ultimate goal is a thermometer and a vacuum-insulated container. You all should practice first and earn some money to improve your lives. When you have enough technology, I have an experiment that requires your products as equipment. If this experiment achieves my expected goals, your names can also appear in the textbook. Chapter 65, Making Money with Knowledge. Principal, you can't play favorites. That's right, show me a way to get rich too. Several students immediately felt uneasy when they saw Duval and his friends making money. Frederick felt helpless, a little impressed by these nerdy people. Don't worry, he could only say. There are always ways to make money, plenty of them. Why don't you all walk around, explore more, and think more? Think about what inconveniences in your life and work can be improved, replaced by more advanced technology, and how such replacements can be profitable. There are many examples like this. From the big ones like blowers in iron smelting furnaces and water pumps in farmland, to the small ones like washing machines and household chores. It all depends on whether you can find them. With that, he dismissed All Might and Diesel without waiting for anyone to react. All Might's office in the blacksmith shop resembled a study. The scent of parchment, ink, and women's perfume filled the air upon entering. She's my wife, Almut introduced him to Frederick, and also my assistant. After Frederick and Mrs. Almut exchanged greetings, she poured tea for everyone and then went to prepare lunch. Diesel smirked and said to Almut, "You introduced her the wrong way just now. It should have been assistant first, then wife." Frederick understood immediately. This kind of thing was quite common among scholars. He didn't pursue the gossip. After taking a sip of his tea, he asked Almut, "Now that we have a suitable power source, can we start improving the machine tools?" Almut said proudly, "We've already made improvements. We've already built 2 or 3 prototypes of the new lathes, drilling machines, boring machines, grinders, and punching machines. I don't think improving the existing machines is very meaningful. They can only serve as a transition." Then, somewhat helplessly, he added, "It's just that many people have a problem these days. They're all focused on making big bucks like BASF, and their minds aren't on the real work." The power of example was immense, and it happened to someone so familiar, so it was inevitable that people's hearts were uneasy. Diesel said with a hint of resignation, "Yes, not only did Almut students study with BASF before, but even my students here have the same idea." Duval came right away when he heard the principal was looking for him. Frederick was at a loss for words regarding this situation. He could only say, "Why don't you handle them? Why do they have the misconception that the projects I'm focusing on aren't profitable? For example, take the machines that mass-produce screws and nails, and the machines that produce wire and sheet metal. They can make money, but you need the machines to make them." All he could do now was to rely on his reputation to keep some people in the fold. Almut said, "Principal, how about this? Bring out any good ideas you have, and we'll organize the students to research them." Frederick thought for a moment and thought this was a good idea. He only had a rough idea of many things, like the over 40 parts of the commune universal simple steel rolling mill. It was impossible for him to remember them all. It would be better to let them research the details, thereby cultivating a group of talented people, freeing up his energy for theoretical work. After some thought, Frederick said, "Why not build an industry university research platform within the university to bridge knowledge and industry?" Almut and Diesel exchanged glances, vaguely understanding the idea, though not entirely. Diesel gestured for Almut to ask. He had the most contact with Frederick and could better understand the president's perspective. Almut asked, "How does this platform work?" After organizing his thoughts, Frederick said, "The platform we built is open to both the school and the society. Workshops can put problems encountered in production on this platform and indicate the corresponding rewards after solving the problems. Simply put, this is a market where you use money to buy knowledge and use knowledge to make money." After listening, Almut thought for a while and said, "It's a bit like a wanted poster, but the wanted criminals have become a series of problems, and we are bounty hunters." Diesel nodded and said, "That's good. Sometimes we will encounter things that we don't understand and need help from others. If there is no one we know who can provide help, we have to ask around to know who to ask for help." Then he said to Almut, "Let's discuss it tomorrow and try to come up with a plan before the Winter Spirit Festival." Almut's brows suddenly frowned, and then he said, "We should keep some technologies confidential. If the technology is leaked, there will be a lot of trouble." Frederick was about to say this, but he felt relieved to see that they had considered this as well. He said to Almut, "Let's start by mass-producing today's magic muscle machines, as well as the matching winches and plowshares. It would be best if they can be produced in time for next year's spring plowing." "Making money is important," Almut replied. "That's no problem. We can improve the cooling system while producing, and we can produce 1 or 2 prototypes before the Winter Spirit Festival." Frederick immediately said, "Okay, if we can produce 1 set before the Winter Spirit Festival, I'll give it away for advertising." Almut agreed immediately. Diesel said to him quietly, "Don't forget about my things. The dark steel cans and light tin are the most important. The pipes can be prepared later." Almut replied, I know. I will arrange someone to prepare them for you tomorrow." Frederick thought about it, asked Carpo to leave the study and close the door first, and then said, "This matter is also very important. It involves the new weapons of the territory. I plan to talk about it after the new year." "Oh, so," Almut frowned. "Principal, do you really want to use that thing as a weapon?" When they first met, Frederick brought up the idea of a magic air gun at dinner, but no one cared about it at the time, because no one could say how powerful this thing was. They thought it was just slightly better than a slingshot. Diesel threw a magic shield to block the propagation of sound, and whispered, "We did an experiment a few days ago. We used the steel balls of bearings as projectiles and a steel pipe as a guide tube. The target was a pig 50 meters away. If the power of the jet tank is strengthened, as long as it can hit the target, it is indeed not a problem to replace the crossbow. Compared to the crossbow, it does not have the disadvantage of rain and moisture damaging the string, and it consumes very little physical strength. Elmet studied the golem puppet to use it in combat. Although it has made a lot of civilian products such as bearings recently, no one in Wessenland University can compare with it in terms of military knowledge. When he heard it, he immediately found the problem, as long as it can hit the target. You mean it is difficult to hit it? Diesel said a little disappointedly. Yes, the flight path of the projectile is random and erratic after leaving the guide tube. Frederick pinched his chin and thought for a while, and decided to take this opportunity to tell them everything about the equipment and let them study it. According to the positioning in his mind, Elmet was more responsible for manufacturing and processing, and Diesel was responsible for the theoretical design of the product. Since they were all here today, he might as well pour out all his imagined equipment. After Diesel finished sighing and talked about the accuracy problems he found in his experiment, Frederick asked Elmet for blank parchment, charcoal pencil and ruler. While trying to think and recall, he wrote and drew on the parchment. Chapter 66 Weapons and Equipment. In a previous life, Frederick had heard that among the gifts presented to Emperor Qianlong during the McCarthy mission to China in 1793 were British-made air rifles. Curious, he researched the history of air rifles and discovered that the Austrian army had deployed a small number of them during that period. This air rifle, called the Windbuch, was 1.2 meters long, weighed 4.5 kilograms, had a caliber of 11.7 millimeters or 13 millimeters, and a muzzle velocity of 152 meters per second. With a full tank of gas, its effective range was a little over 100 meters, varying with the number of shots fired as the tank pressure dropped. However, the gas tanks and accessories were unreliable at the time, prone to damage, and manual pumping was cumbersome, resulting in limited production and its rapid withdrawal from regular military service. Frederick's primary concern was the rifle's rate of fire. It had a magazine parallel to the barrel, holding 20-round lead bullets. Loading was accomplished by a lever above the trigger. A single press of the trigger could load a lead bullet. A skilled shooter could fire a full load in half a minute, and it could also be fired from a prone position. He drew a diagram of a magic air gun on paper. It was a muzzle loader, with a spray canister inside the stock and a rifled barrel. It used many A bullets. This combination was based on current processing technology and economics. Mini A bullets could solve the problem of large misalignment between the bullet and the barrel due to low machining precision. Furthermore, lead was cheap, and he couldn't afford copper bullets, which were now currency. The bullet's rotation increases stability, he said, pointing to the diagram. The wooden plug at the tail expands the bullet's tail under air pressure, keeping it in close contact with the barrel. This allows it to rotate with a rifling while also preventing air leaks and increasing power. Elmet understood and pointed to the tail of the bullet. This structure is also used in blowpipes, which are made of leather. Think of it as a special blowpipe that uses magic to fire metal bullets. That makes it easier to understand. Well, it's the trigger mechanism that activates the magic circle that needs to be studied. Frederick didn't know much about triggers himself, so he let Elmet do the research. He then drew a diagram of the ammunition feeding system. The crossbar used for loading bullets is in the shape of a, and the round hole in the middle is aligned with the barrel. Just push it sideways to align the round hole with the magazine on the side of the barrel, and the spring in the magazine will push a bullet in. After you let go, the spring sheet outside the gun will press the crossbar back, so that the bullet in the round hole is aligned with the barrel. The ones that were loaded from the muzzle just now are sold to hunters and equipped for militias, Frederick said. The regular army uses this type, and they can load bullets quickly. Diesel frowned and said, there will be a leak in this position. It's okay, Elmet replied with a smile. Use a little magic muscle here, and make it deform a little when you start the jet tank, and the gap will be blocked. Diesel nodded, and Frederick opened his mouth. There was actually such an operation. There's another problem, Diesel said. The bullet is a little smaller than the barrel. When the muzzle is pointed downwards, coupled with a vibration, will the bullet fall out? Frederick blinked. He hadn't really considered this question, but now it seemed reasonable. On the battlefield, anything could happen. It would be ridiculous if the bullet fell out while running. Elmet pondered, actually, we could make the bullet a little larger so that it would only be pushed against the end of the barrel. That way, we wouldn't need to make the tail, Diesel pondered for a moment, then pointed to the end of the muzzle-loading rifle barrel on the blueprint and said, I think we could improve it. We could put a shell around the jet canister and mount it directly there. We'd add a handle, with a latch on the shell and the surrounding structure. Twist the handle upwards to clear the latch, then pull it back to reveal the rear opening of the barrel. The bullet would be forced in from the side by a spring, and by pushing the hand forward, the canister would push the bullet into the barrel. Frederick's forehead was slightly sweaty. Wasn't that just like pulling the bolt? Wow, they've advanced from the 18th century to the 19th in a flash. All Might said, why not just add a spring to the back of the jet can? No need to fix it. Just add a few tracks. When it sprays, it moves backwards on its own. When it returns to its original position, it pushes the bullet into the barrel. If you control the timing well, you can fire bullets continuously. Frederick wiped the sweat from his forehead. Oh my God, we're already in the 20th century. He now believed that talent is everywhere. To have become scholars in a place like Constantine with a rich academic atmosphere, All Might and Diesel were undoubtedly among the world's top intellectuals. With even a little inspiration, they could continue their research on their own. Frederick said, both of your ideas make sense, but it's better to take it one step at a time. Let's start with the simplest. All Might and Diesel paused. However, All Might said, loading the bullets from the mouth of the barrel is a bit cumbersome. How about a door-like structure that can be opened to load the bullets from the back of the barrel? Faced with such a brilliant mind, what else could Frederick say? He'd even come up with a folding shotgun. Okay, he said, let's talk about other things, starting with a helmet. As he spoke, Frederick drew a steel helmet on the parchment. It had a brim in front and a circle of outward-sloping steel plates around the ears and back of the neck, giving it a distinctly German feel. All Might nodded, adding a few strokes with a charcoal pencil. That's good. The ears and back of the neck are protected. Just stamp them out of steel and trim them. It'll require a significant amount of magical muscle to provide the necessary pressure, but that's not a problem. It needs some reinforcement, though. Add a rib from the back of the head to the crown, and maybe a vent in the front for ventilation. Frederick said nothing, letting him have his way. Diesel's eyes flickered as he asked, Principal, your cavalry will also be equipped with lances, right? Frederick nodded and replied, of course. Diesel smiled and asked, I have a lance specifically designed to deal with armored knights. Would you like one? Oh, Frederick was a little surprised. What does it look like? Dealing with a tin can was no easy task. Ordinary cavalry could only rely on outnumbering the enemy until they stopped, then they could crowd in from a blind spot and pull them off their horses. Then slowly finish them off. Diesel drew a picture on parchment and proudly introduced it. This lance is 3.5 meters long. Its most distinctive feature is the ring of tin cans around the tip, which can explode forward. Frederick blinked. Did he need a gas mask? Try to make a few, he said. What about armor? All Might asked. At least a breastplate, plate or scale armor, Frederick replied. Scale armor. It's economical and easy to repair. Oh, and an engineer's shovel. Chapter 67. If you don't get the gunpowder, someone else will. Frederick didn't add many features to his engineer's shovel. It was just an ordinary small shovel, 70 centimeters long, with a solid wood shaft and a T-shaped handle at the end. The blade was about 20 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters long, with a slightly pointed top, serrations on one side, a bottle opener like a hook, two small holes for string, and a sharp edge on the side. He didn't try to make it into a hoe, as it wasn't intended for plowing, so the cost didn't increase. Amit explained that it was simple, requiring only a new mold. Principal, Diesel suddenly asked, would you like to try making a weapon out of gunpowder? Frederick blinked and asked, what is that? Diesel replied, it's an elixir invented by Eastern alchemists. It's said to be made from 67 ingredients and 81 steps, and different recipes produce different colors of flame. You know the pagan merchants, so you can ask them to buy it for you. It's great for arson and can circumvent magic checks. All Might smiled and said, this gunpowder explodes if ignited in a jar. 2 years ago, Julius used it in a duel with Diesel. But Diesel was the better choice. Gunpowder had to be purchased in the East, and it was very expensive. He only needed enough bread and wine. Frederick leaned back in his chair, frowning. He hadn't expected gunpowder to appear so unexpectedly. He didn't know the real situation in the East, but it sounded like the gunpowder sold there was full of impurities, perhaps to produce different colors of flame. Maybe it was for fireworks. He didn't want to make gunpowder, primarily because it lacked technical expertise and he worried about someone else learning it. So, before he discovered the 3 acids and 2 bases and learned from the Jinshaji border region base area to create a drug to treat angina, he planned to use magic to create explosions. Besides, anyone with a keen eye could easily figure out the general formula for black powder by researching raw material procurement. Furthermore, as Diesel had said, it could evade magical detection. What if his enemies later developed a roadside bomb? The problem was, it already existed, so he had no choice but to follow suit. After witnessing these 2 brilliant minds, Frederick felt it was only a matter of time before others figured out the correct formula for gunpowder. So someone already knows how to make gunpowder, Frederick sighed. All Might and Diesel exchanged glances, their thoughts aligning. Principal, All Might asked cautiously, you know how to make this? Frederick nodded. Diesel said seriously, I wouldn't be surprised if the principal said now that he was going to have a baby. Frederick pinched his chin and said, I remember that the university's annual salary list will be signed for me tomorrow. Diesel immediately backed down. Frederick recalled the contents of the militia mind-blasting textbook, trial version, and then said, the wandering scholar said that making gunpowder is actually very simple. Its 3 ingredients are all easily available. One is the raw material for making glass, one is used to fumigate insects, and the other is charcoal. Actually, the explosion power of powdered gunpowder is not very strong. When it is made into granules, it is much more powerful. Diesel asked thoughtfully, can it be made now? I remember Julius went to Venice. If I showed him some of this gunpowder, he would definitely run over without even eating. Amit smiled and asked him. I remember you still owed him money, Diesel replied nonchalantly. I introduced the principal to him, and that little money didn't even cover the introduction fee. Frederick asked them in confusion, who is Julius? Diesel replied, Julius is an alchemist from the Duchy of Nassau. Like us, he went to Constantine to study and stayed there. His experiments were quite expensive. He got off the boat halfway and went to Venice to find investors who were taking advantage of him. The Duchy of Nassau was located northwest of Wesson, not far east of Cologne, the capital of the Rhine Confederation. Frederick thought for a moment and finally made a decision. Well, then, I'll try and see if I can make the gunpowder in winter. I'll send someone to bring it to him when the weather warms up. Amit, I need you to help me modify some tools. Tools for making gunpowder must be made of wood. Even stone requires wood, otherwise a spark would destroy everyone. No problem, Amit replied. Let's have lunch first, and we'll talk afterward. It was already noon, and the 3 of them were feeling a little hungry after all the conversation. They ate a small lunch of steamed buns with sauerkraut and cooked sausage, and then went back to their respective tasks in the afternoon. The next day, Amit sent someone to inform them that the raw materials and tools were ready. Frederick arrived at the blacksmith's shop in a carriage. Not only were Almide and Diesel there, but Manuel was also waiting for him, carrying the university's annual salary payout and a thin, middle-aged man he hadn't seen before. Diesel pointed at the middle-aged man, dressed in shabby clothes and new shoes, and said, Principal, that's Julius. Frederick blinked. What was going on? We'd just mentioned Julius the day before yesterday and had been planning to meet him in Venice, so why was he here now? Could his last name be Cieo? A novel like that would surely flop. Julius, upon seeing Frederick, immediately came over to greet him. I've heard of your name for so long, it's like thunder in my ears. Seeing you today, you're truly a distinguished figure. Frederick looked at Diesel and the others with a puzzled expression, questioning the incessant chatter. Diesel interrupted Julius's flattery, saying, Speak for yourself. Julius immediately straightened up and said proudly, The civil unrest in Constantinople is linked to the Doge of Venice. I bombed his house and was planning to run home, but on the way I heard you were here, so I came to visit. I didn't expect to hear the legendary story of a genius. Frederick was furious as he watched the man continue his rambling. But the truth was clear, the bombing of the Doge's house was irrelevant. This man must have run all the way here in the freezing cold, over mountain roads, and looked like he'd endured a lot of hardship. One thing caught Frederick's attention. He introduced himself as the rector and asked, Are you willing to work at the University of Wiesenberg? Julius replied immediately, Yes, of course. Why wouldn't I want to study under the rector? Frederick sensed something was amiss and glanced at the others in the office. It was Diesel who cleared up his confusion. Julius just mixed the 3 materials and tried to ignite them, and it seemed to work well. Frederick understood, but was a little worried, so he said, I have some work that requires the supervision of an alchemist. but it requires someone I can trust. Julius answered without hesitation, I can pledge my loyalty to His Excellency the Baron. I will write home later and ask my son Joachim to come and serve you. Frederick frowned slightly and asked, reason? Julius answered sincerely, knowledge. Frederick understood that he came for the knowledge of the wandering scholar, there was no doubt about that, but he was a little unsure and looked at the other three. Manuel said seriously, Julius is a scholar who can dedicate his heart to knowledge. Chapter 68 Gunpowder Weapons. Previous chapter about making gunpowder was blocked the next afternoon. Frederick invited Almite, Diesel, and Julius to the manor to discuss how to use the black powder. Julius' eyes were bloodshot, clearly sleep-deprived. He saw the charcoal burning in the fireplace, and even the charcoal in the small tea stove. Frederick's eyes were also slightly bloodshot. Seeing this, he immediately handed him a note. This note would allow him to ask Manuel for funds to prevent him from going into heroic mode and collecting charcoal from his home. After the year-end inventory of various industries, his dividends were sent to the treasury, and most of them went to Wessenland University before they were even warm. How generous of the president, Julius said flatteringly after seeing the amount on the list. Frederick then handed him 2 parchment booklets, the thread on the top revealing that they were newly bound. The first booklet contained a recipe for the raw materials of a certain angina drug, written overnight, the same as those used in the Jinshaji border region base area. As an alchemist, Julius was familiar with the materials mentioned. He had already worked with them in his laboratory, but in very low quantities. Except for soap and glycerin, none had ever been produced on such a large scale. The second booklet contained instructions for making fireworks shells. It also mentioned how different metals would produce different colors of flames. If paperboard was unavailable, slime could be used instead, which was also waterproof. Frederick said to Julius, take a look at these methods and see if they're feasible. If so, start the industry next spring, but be careful about safety. Julius flipped through the booklet briefly and then asked seriously, Principal, how does the Wechsler degree here scale temperature? Frederick blinked and pointed at Almite, replying, ask him when you have time. His students are working on a new thermometer. Julius tucked the 2 booklets into his arms and asked, Principal, could I get some of my students to help? Frederick nodded, of course. Julius looked relieved. Where there are people, there are communities. The same was true at the University of Wessenland. The relationships between faculty and students formed distinct groups, and within the larger groups, there were smaller ones. Frederick didn't care, as long as they recognized him as the president, that was all that mattered. Getting back to business, he placed a piece of parchment on the table and said, this is a weapon I came up with made from black powder. Diesel took one look and said, it's very similar to a gun, except the barrel is thicker and much shorter. It fires a large projectile filled with gunpowder, I guess. Frederick nodded. After some thought last night, he had decided against using black powder as a propellant. The simple reason was the rate of fire. A muzzleloader's rate of 1 or 2 rounds per minute was unbearable. Enemies on the battlefield these days had magical shields. With that kind of firepower, and the accuracy bonus comparable to Brownian motion, it wouldn't be enough to overload their shields quickly enough, leaving them vulnerable to direct fire. A breech loader looked appealing, but the cartridge case wasn't affordable at the moment, the manufacturing cost was too high. Overall, the current trend in firearms is still towards magic airguns. Therefore, Frederick decided to use black powder as a cheap explosive. This time, he first brought out a 50mm caliber grenade launcher. Its structure is similar to that of a muzzle loader, with a hard slime shell, black powder in the middle, and a circle of bearing steel balls around it to kill the enemy. Julius studied the grenade and said after a moment, with just this little gunpowder, I'm afraid it's not powerful enough. Frederick replied, gunpowder isn't actually very powerful. At a distance, the shockwave isn't much. Using it to propel the steel balls can cause greater damage. Its role on the battlefield is to strike densely packed enemy formations, disrupt enemy formations, and disrupt their offensive spells. All Might, knowledgeable about combat, nodded in agreement. A cavalry charge typically launches at a distance of 50 to 100 meters. If it can reach that far, even if it only damages the horses, it could prevent a decisive charge. Diesel put down his teacup and said with a smile, that way you can sell your puppet horses. I think we should prepare more types of these projectiles, such as incendiary, freezing, and swamp-destroying ones. All Might exclaimed in surprise, good boy, you want a small magic crystal cannon for each person. Why don't you just make the jet tanks bigger so the projectiles can reach 2 kilometers? Even the magic crystal cannons will take the beating." Diesel smiled and said, "You think I haven't thought of this? I'm already working on the design, but you need to work harder on the materials. I've designed a 75mm jet cannon. The tube needs to be very thick to withstand the air pressure. Together with the frame, it weighs almost a ton," Almut said with some embarrassment. "If using elemental steel is still too expensive, if we want to produce better ordinary steel, I'm afraid we'll have to look to that person." Diesel nodded. "That's true." Frederick was about to ask which expert they were talking about when Julius chimed in. "Indeed, he's been researching ordinary steel. I wonder if they're still alive." "Excuse me," Frederick asked, "who are you talking about?" Julius replied, "An acquaintance of ours, known as Manuels, the stainless steel alchemist. 2 years ago, he traveled to the east with Fritz, the urine alchemist." Frederick blinked. What kind of nickname was that? Seeing the conversation veer off on another tangent, he pulled out another piece of parchment to redirect the conversation. "What is this?" Julius asked. "The church roof." Frederick curled his lips and said, "A gunpowder-powered rocket, used for sieges." The only military black powder rockets he knew of were the Congreve rocket, like the larger Chuan Hao, and the later, improved Hal rocket. The former's accuracy still depended on faith, while the latter's tail blades rotated the projectile, making it better and requiring less prayer. However, he wanted to see if the Meteorological Bureau's Jinai 42 double-chambered earthen rocket could be scaled up for battlefield use. This meteorological rocket looked a bit like a V2, 82.5 centimeters tall, 5 centimeters in diameter, capable of reaching a vertical altitude of over 3 kilometers and carrying a payload of 100 grams. Frederick reasoned that if it were scaled up, as long as its range exceeded 1 kilometer, it would be comparable to the Hal rocket. The three scholars studied it for a long time, seemingly understanding it, yet not quite. Frederick had no choice but to wait until he had some free time to join them in the study. Then he pulled out his final weapon, the conscienceless cannon. "That's a good one," Julius nodded. "A trebuchet could be used, too," Frederick said. "It has a very short range, only about 200 meters, and it's not very accurate, so it's usually used defensively." Ahmet nodded and said, "Not bad. It can be used to destroy siege engines and even during sieges. There's just one problem. Such thin iron sheets are hard to make." Frederick was stunned and slapped his forehead. In his previous life, when he was broke, he had someone smuggle thousands of tons of iron sheets. "Forget about that for now," he said. "Next year, we'll research the steel rolling mill. I remember there's a hand-crank lead rolling mill. We can modify that." Ahmet nodded. After discussing the three weapons, everyone chatted for a while, had dinner together, and then dispersed. Winter Soul Festival was coming soon, so any matters could be discussed after the new year. Shortly after dinner, the butler, Afu, reported to Frederick on the preparations for the Winter Soul Festival gifts. Frederick expressed satisfaction and asked, "Afu, what's your son doing now?" Afu replied calmly, "Bruce is running to Bryant on odd days and to Benz's carriage workshop on even days. He's unpredictable." Frederick nodded slightly and said, "I'm planning to build a workshop specializing in weapons production. I need someone I can trust to manage it. Ask him if he's interested." Afu immediately bowed and replied, "Thank you for your trust, sir. I'm sure he'll be interested." Frederick said, "Okay, tell him to come see me after the new year." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 69 Winter Spirit Festival. Winter's Day was the happiest day of the year for children. Frederick, in bed, was pricked on the nose by Taro with the end of his braid, and after a while, he reluctantly yawned and got out of bed. "Wow! What a beautiful new dress!" Frederick complimented the maid on her new outfit upon waking. Every Winter's Day, servants were required to wear new clothes, even if it was just socks. At Frederick's, servants were allowed to wear clothes other than their uniforms. Taro, the daughter of a tax collector, was already well off, and her maidship at Frederick's was well paid, so it was only natural that she would wear a new winter dress for the new year. "I worked so hard to get this lace," she said proudly. "It's the latest style from the South." Frederick admired the lace trim at the collar of her dress and got up to get dressed. These days, lace was handmade, so beautiful it cost more than the clothes themselves. Frederick walked over to the dressing mirror, and Taro helped him put on his new suit, which had been warmed by the stove. As he was getting dressed, Katie walked in wearing a bright red new dress, holding a long wooden stick in one hand and a dagger in the other. "Come," Katie said with a kind smile, "let me see if you've grown taller." Frederick stood there straight. Katie held the stick up behind him, determined his height, and then marked it with the dagger. "A lot taller," Katie nodded with satisfaction. Frederick smiled and said, "That's for sure." Katie pinched his cheek, wrinkled her nose, and said, "If you go to bed early every night, you'll be taller." Frederick just smiled. Katie gave Taro the stick that recorded Frederick's height every Winter Souls festival to put away, as she would need it later. The two of them went to the dining room. After sitting down, Frederick saw Psyche there and said with surprise, "You're back." Psyche had been away for a while, and no one knew where she went. Psyche yawned and replied, "Well, I'm back. It's freezing outside." The maid brought out breakfast for the day, a completely new treat, a large fried donut smeared with honey. When something new appeared on the table, it was only right to look at Katie. As expected, Katie said with a hint of pride, "Hurry up and eat. This is a sun donut. It won't taste good if it's cold." Frederick wondered why it wasn't a solid circle if it was the sun. He took his knife and fork and cut a piece, discovering it was filled with something. He put it in his mouth and discovered the filling was made from roasted walnuts, hazelnuts, and almonds, crushed and mixed with flour. The slightly sweet maltose didn't mask the nuts' flavor, but rather enhanced their fragrance. Delicious. Frederick immediately cut another piece and began to eat. Katie's smile widened. After breakfast, Frederick entered the living room. The fireplace was already lit, suffusing the room with warmth. The table was filled with small gift boxes wrapped in colorful cloth and tied with ribbons and bows. They were all the same size, just different colors, forming a small mountain. From Alfu to the gatekeeper, everyone lined up in the living room to receive the gifts from Master Wesson. Frederick couldn't remember what was inside, but there was lipstick, gold coins, and a retractable tickler. He got whatever he wanted. On this day, not only did leaders give gifts to their subordinates, but elders also gave gifts to their juniors, and friends also gave gifts to each other. After Frederick distributed the gifts, it was time to open his own. Some of the gifts had arrived yesterday, and the first one he opened was from Maria. It was a wooden figurine with a football next to it. The painting was not good enough to tell who it was, but judging by the clothes, it was probably Frederick. Next came Sophia's gift, a purple wool scarf. The purple dye here is equally precious, and Frederick would be the most handsome guy in the room when wearing it at an outdoor event among the nobility. Philip gave a dip pen with a gold nib and a wooden barrel inlaid with gold patterns. The Grand Duke of Mainz presented a practical and unpretentious warbow, but Frederick could only use it when he reached adulthood. Archbishop Victor presented a holy scripture, with scriptures written in dark gold ink on white parchment, and a loki and gorgeous silver-white lace around it. The most important thing was the signature on the title page, which was the name of the current pope. The scholars of Wiesenberg University gave Frederick a box of books, which were carefully selected by Manuel. Finally, there was King William's gift. It was a tradition to give gifts to vassals and subordinates on this day, and the gift Frederick received was a gold toothpick. After he finished unpacking, the others returned to the room and brought their gifts. Richardino presented him with a book, solemnly explaining, "This is a long-standing sword manual, older than Psyche. It's said to have been brought back from a secret realm by a swordsman. For years, no one has been able to master the techniques within. I'm giving it to you. It depends on whether you can grasp it." Frederick took it with both hands and immediately bowed in gratitude, saying, "Thank you, Master." Richardino patted him on the shoulder and said, "Work hard." Next, Katie presented Frederick with an equally ancient collection of poetry. "This collection is over 500 years old," she said. "It's a collection of poems from all over the ancient empire." Frederick accepted it and said sweetly, "Thank you, sister." Psyche came over carrying a long bag and first pulled out a sword, handing it to Frederick. Frederick took it with both hands and pulled it from its wooden scabbard. The sword gleamed silver, but it looked unremarkable, save for a thumb-sized golden statue of a goddess inlaid on the blade above the guard. The goddess wore a long robe, a laurel wreath on her head, and raised her hands, with wings behind her. A heavy gasp suddenly filled the living room. Frederick looked over and saw Richardino's eyes widen, his beard twitching, his hands instinctively reaching out. "Let me touch it," the swordmaster exclaimed excitedly. Just one touch, Frederick immediately understood it was a precious sword and handed it to his master. Richard cautiously reached out to take the sword, but suddenly stiffened. He said, "I'm going to wash my hands first," and disappeared, leaving behind a gust of wind that made Psyche and Katie's skirts flutter slightly. Frederick blinked, and Richard returned. He solemnly accepted the sword and examined it carefully. Mithril sword body, golden goddess of victory. Richard was so excited that his body trembled a little. "It is indeed the sword of remedies Master San Nascimento. I never thought that I would be able to touch the real thing in this life." When he said this, he was suddenly stunned, raised his head and asked Psyche, "Wasn't this sword stolen many years ago? Where did you find it?" Psyche shrugged and said, "His descendants sold it for the sake of face, and said it was stolen. It changed hands a few times and finally came to me." Richard sighed deeply, shook his head and said, "Master San Nascimento is the greatest swordsman so far, and his descendants are also talented, but now the halo is also an obstacle." After that, he returned the sword to Frederick. Frederick bowed to Psyche and said, "Thank you very much for this precious gift." "I'll treasure it," Psyche replied. "It's just a sword. It's just too much of a nuisance to keep here, so I'll give it to you, but don't get cocky. Even if you take it, anyone here could hit you with a table leg." Then, she pulled something out of her bag and gave it to Richard. Frederick's mouth twitched when he saw the gift. "Here," Psyche said, "a bar fishing rod. Together, they're 12 meters long. You can go dolphin fishing." Richard's face immediately broke into a bright smile, and he hurriedly thanked her. Finally, Psyche took out a pair of daggers and belt holsters and gave them to Katie. Katie immediately fastened the holsters around her waist, unsheathed the daggers with both hands, and shook them in a few whirlwinds, like black roses blooming in the air. The blades were black, and Frederick couldn't tell what they were, but when he saw Katie approach and embrace Psyche, he knew they were valuable items. Then, Frederick was dragged outside by Katie for a sword test. Lunch was later than usual that day, and afternoon tea began. "Delicious fish, isn't it?" Richard said proudly. "I caught it," Frederick smiled. "This yellow belly fish has been farmed in Wessenland for centuries, and every year during the Winter Spirit Festival, it's in high demand. Today, the yellow belly fish and other fish, large and small, are breaded and fried. Many people buy them ready, then drizzle them with sauces to their liking." After lunch, Frederick took a carriage back to the castle on the hilltop to prepare for the torchlight procession that evening. As dusk approached, many people had already prepared their supplies for the night and were waiting along the approach to the castle and in front of their homes. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only a glimmer of light at the edge of the sky. The longest night was about to begin. The last ray of light faded, and the sky darkened completely, plunging the world into darkness. The north wind howled. The castle gates rumbled open, and Baron Friedrich von Wesson, holding a torch in his right hand and ringing a diamond-encrusted bell in his left, slowly emerged. The light was so faint, seemingly invisible from afar, flickering in the winter wind, as if it would be extinguished at any moment. Old Knight Fritz lit his own torch alongside Baron Wesson's and followed him forward. A second, a third, a fourth, a fire dragon, rising from the hilltop castle, slowly but surely approached Wessenberg. In the dark, deserted city, the ringing of bells heralded the arrival of light. Holding torches, people drew flames from the dragon, lighting branches and handing them to their families to light their own eternal lamps. Then, they joined the procession, becoming part of the dragon's ranks. In this longest night, countless previously dim flames converged, banishing the endless darkness. Chapter 70, It's time to pay the money at the end of the year. The period between winter souls and the new year was a time for people to rest after a busy year. Even bandits and thieves took a break, but only the tavern remained open. If the street corners and alleyways served as information exchange centers for middle-aged and elderly women, the tavern was the intelligence station for men. Shortly after dinner time, Brian pushed open the tavern's door, and the incoming cold wind made the patrons shrink their necks. By the time he had taken off his coat and hat, shaken off the snowflakes, and hung them on the wall hooks, the tavern owner's daughter had already placed his usual wine and snacks at his usual table. Taverns in residential areas served as social gatherings for the men in the surrounding area, with their own unspoken rules, such as which seats were reserved for regulars and which were reserved for occasional visitors. Brian sat down at his table and took a sip when a man with a goatee at the next table asked, Are you confident about tomorrow's game against the Crane team? Of course, Bryant said confidently, setting down his glass. Don't be fooled by those dock workers' quickness. When it comes to kicking, we're the best. Now that the weather's colder, people have more free time, and more people are playing football. Football fields have been built not just in Wessenland, but elsewhere, and many villages and farms have formed their own teams. Compared to the idle winters of the past, this year everyone has more to do. With a smug look on his face, as if he's making some big news, the man with a goatee whispered to Bryant, "Did you hear? Old Franz is retiring next year." Bryant nodded slightly. It was no secret. The man with a goatee stroked his beard and asked, slightly smugly, "Do you know what old Franz is going to do next?" Bryant, completely unaware of the situation, grabbed some roasted broad beans from his plate and placed them on his. Goatee said mysteriously, "I heard he'll be in charge of football and other matters from now on, like setting the rules, organizing matches, and training referees." "Oh?" Bryant asked curiously. "How are the matches organized?" Goatee said, munching on roasted broad beans. "I heard teams sign up, and the matches are scheduled on Sundays. There's a champion, and there's a prize. The final results won't be announced until next year." The mention of a prize perked Bryant up, but Goatee didn't get any further information. The two chatted for a while about the afternoon's match between the coachman's team, the wheel, and the fishhook team. Then, a sturdy young man arrived at a tavern and sat down at Bryant's table. He sat down, ordered a glass of cider, and then took out 2 bags and emptied out their contents. From one bag were thin, finger-sized pieces of wood, and from the other, a sturdy, large bag, were several gleaming silver cruise coins and a pile of copper coins of various sizes. Bryant curiously asked the young man, "Bobo, where did you get all that money?" Bobo looked up and replied, "This is all my wages." Bryant exclaimed in surprise, "You've managed to save so much?" The goateed man smiled and said to Bryant, "He just finished his apprenticeship this year. His mother was afraid he'd squander his money, so she told him to wait until the end of the year to pay him his full wages." Bryant understood and jokingly said, "Good boy, you're so young and already getting an annual salary." "While I'm only getting a monthly salary," Bobo replied with a few words, somewhat embarrassed. Annual salaries were reserved for the rich and powerful. Among workers, only clerks and exceptional craftsmen like Bryant were eligible for monthly pay. Ordinary workers were paid daily. Bobo laid out his pay on the table and then spread out the wood chips. Bryant asked him, "Isn't he being underpaid?" Popovich began to calculate. "There are 30 days in a month, so minus Sundays, that's 27 days. There are 12 months in a year, minus the 10 days off we have now, that's 314 days. I make 34 coppers a day, so that's..." He pondered for a long time, clearly overthinking it. 10,676 coppers. Finally, the innkeeper at the nearby bar figured it out for him. "Thank you." Popovich immediately thanked the innkeeper and counted the money, 5 cruise silver coins and 10,176 coppers of varying denominations. Bryant took a sip of beer and ate some roasted broad beans. "It's 5 florins, 6 cruise, and 76 copper coins a year. Stonemason wages aren't much, after all. When I was just starting out, like you, I made 7 florins and 17 cruise a year. Our blacksmith shop will open next year. Ordinary masters will get a gold coin a month, and apprentices will get 10 cruise." Bobo scratched his head, a little envious, but there was nothing he could do. He was afraid of fire. He began to divide the money into several parts. He put aside the 50 copper head tax, the 10 cruise income tax, and the 1 cruise union fee. These would be paid after the Lunar New Year. Bryant and Goatee were chatting about tomorrow's football game. He glanced at the 3 piles of money and knew what they were for. He reminded him, "Remember to save some for the door tax. You should help pay the family taxes, too." Bobo was startled, then remembered that the house was taxed according to the number of doors. He quickly took out another cruise and put them in. At this time, the man with the goatee said, "I heard that the young master is going to reduce taxes next year." Bryant nodded and said, "I heard that too. It started with a village. They said that 25% of the crop harvest will be deducted as planting grain and food rations, and the remaining amount will be counted as rent. We are also reducing taxes in the city. I heard that the head tax will be abolished and the income tax will be reduced a little. By the way, the young master is recruiting soldiers next year and said that those collected will be tax-free." The man with the goatee frowned and said, "Why reduce taxes so much? It's enough. What if the young master sees that the taxes are low next year and then increases them more the year after? You don't understand, Bryant laughed. The young master even came to me to ask about this. According to the young master, if everyone's taxes are reduced, they will have extra money to buy farm tools from me and clothes from you. Then our business will be better. Our business is good because the people we hire have work to do, and they also make more money. It's not just us. Everyone buys more things in the past, shoes, hats, tableware, etc., and everyone makes money. Goldberg stroked his beard and nodded, saying, that seems to be the case. It makes some sense. Then Bobo came over to Goldberg, placed 3 pieces of wood and some coins on the table, and said in a loud voice, Boss, this year I bought a set of blacksmith's clothes on credit from you for 5 kroits, a pullover for 70 coppers, and a woolen sweater for 3 kroits. That's a total of 8 kroits 70 coppers. Do you think that's right? They all worked in the same circle and were neighbors, and seeing that Bobo was rich, they agreed to give him credit for the year. Goldberg looked at the bill on the wood, counted the money, and, again in a loud voice, repeated the clothes and the amount of money. Finally, he said, payment paid. The tavern patrons heard their conversation, serving as a witness to prevent anyone from defaulting. The tavern owner brought a bottle of ink, a quill, and a piece of parchment, and had Goldberg write money received on the back of the wood. He signed, and the owner signed as a witness. Finally, the owner wrote on his parchment the date and year when so and so and so and so settled a bill in his shop, along with the names of the people sitting around, and then had everyone sign. This would be crucial evidence if Bobo and Goatee were to go to court over what happened today. The innkeeper's guarantee gained social prestige, and his words were taken seriously. Then Bobo began to settle the bill with the others at the inn. A pair of leather-covered slime-soled sneakers for 6 cruises, 10 salted fish for 5 cruises, 36 kilograms of cheap cheese for 3 cruises, 3 lean chickens plus a year's worth of eggs for 2 cruises and 40 copper coins, and a year's worth of alcohol for 3 cruises. He saved the extra change. In the end, Bobo was left with 3 florins, 7 cruises, and 16 copper coins. Brian took a sip of wine and said to Popovich with a smile, this is enough to build a 2-story cabin with 1 compartment, and enough for a wedding banquet. All we need is a bride. He spoke a little loudly, his eyes glancing at the tavern owner's daughter. Bobo ignored his random matchmaking and said with some distress, I want to go to the University of Wessenland. I heard that a scholar is running a night school in the city, and it's only 10 kroits a year, but I heard that the university tuition is 5 florins a year, and the textbooks are even more expensive. I have to save more money. Brian thought for a moment and said to him, I know a way, but it's just a rumor. I don't know if it's true. The young master seems to have this idea. Young people who join the army will come back in 5 years. The salary of an ordinary soldier is about the same as your current income, but food and clothes are free. I heard that there are night schools that are also free. The family is tax-free, and you can save a lot of money if you save. The most important thing is that people who have served in the army can reduce a lot of tuition fees at the University of Wessenland. If they have made meritorious service, they can even be exempted from tuition. Bobo's mind instantly became active. In 5 years, he would be only 22 or 23 years old. If he went to the University of Wessenland to study law for a few years, he could work as a clerk in a court or administrative council after graduation, or he could be a lawyer. I heard that a good lawyer can earn more than 100 florins a year. He collected the money on the table and sat there quietly sipping cider, pondering whether to enlist. There was a problem. Everyone knew the war would come in 2 years. What would happen if I died? Could you help me find out? He asked Bryant. What if I die while serving? Bryant agreed, saying, the young master will still be coaching the next football game. I'll ask for you after the game. After the football game, Bryant and Popovich met again at the tavern. Bryant said, I looked into your situation yesterday. The death benefit is 20 times your annual military salary, plus an annual living allowance for your family for 20 years. If you have blood brothers or sisters, you can give the benefits to someone you designate. Popovich sipped his drink and pondered, thinking that if he died, it would look good for his brother to go to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Chapter 71 Spring is coming. 1025. Unnoticed, the once white earth had transformed into vibrant green. The change was so sudden that some people on the street were already donning spring clothes, while others were wiping away sweat in their winter clothes. Katie, still wearing her thick winter clothes at breakfast, returned a short while later, wearing a slim, spring, knee-length skirt that made Richardnell shudder. In the carriage, Richardnell angrily declared, "Young people these days are truly lawless. Today they're showing their calves, and tomorrow the hem won't even cover their knees. And by the day after tomorrow, they'll be completely bare-faced." Frederick wanted to say, "I advise you to mind your own business," but he couldn't defeat the swordmaster, so he could only nod in agreement. Actually, Katie's outfit today wasn't anything special. The skirt, which fell to mid-calf, was paired with thigh-high boots and black garters. She looked lively and cheerful, not at all like a woman in her 30s. How could she be so revealing? The reason for this attire was that the paper mill was still a construction site, and the ground was still muddy after the recent spring snowmelt. Wearing a traditional ankle-length dress would undoubtedly have gotten it stained. Frederick decided to change the subject and asked, "Is there any progress between my sister and Keller?" He had previously asked Katie, and his nose had been pinched red. Richardnell replied, "Fortunately, Katie hasn't said she dislikes him in all this time, and he hasn't hinted or refused either, which means we're off to a good start." Frederick was relieved. These days, arranged marriages for political and economic purposes aside, finding lovers for pleasure is the fastest-growing pursuit. Talk of marriage is extremely reserved, like tea steeped in cold water. Richardnell glanced at the sky outside, where thick clouds were drifting in from the south. He said proudly, "It's rainy this spring, so I secretly borrowed her umbrella from the carriage." Frederick was speechless. The carriage soon arrived at the shores of Lake Brombach, nestled in the mountains north of Weissenberg. From the dock near Weissenberg University, a boat took them to a vast expanse of farmland on the other side of the lake. The lakeside farmland, approximately 1 kilometer wide and 3 kilometers long, primarily grew grass for the horses of Wessen's army. The milk vetch in the meadow had begun to bloom, its lush green dotted with purple stars, and countless bees flitted among the flowers. Quite a crowd had gathered in the fields today, and several tables were set up, each filled with a variety of novelties. Frederick greeted Almite, Diesel, and Julius, then turned to a young man in his early 20s, "Bruce, do you understand how to make these guns?" Bruce, the son of the Wesson family's butler, had been intelligent since childhood. Frederick's father had originally intended him to be a schoolboy with Frederick, hoping he would eventually become his assistant. However, when Frederick was 3 years old, this guy took his young master wearing his own bee-proof suit to clear a hornet's nest. He was later beaten by Alfu, forced to sleep on his stomach for 2 weeks, and finally relegated to the workshop. After the New Year holiday this year, Almite, Diesel, and Julius organized a team of skilled workers to begin trial production of various weapons, and they've achieved initial success. Bruce initially didn't want to run the weapons workshop, finding it boring, but after being beaten and unable to get out of bed for a month, he was forced to choose the latter. However, Frederick took him to Almite and the others, and when he discovered this was a completely new weapons workshop, he immediately accepted the job. "Don't worry, sir," Bruce replied proudly, "I've already understood the production process of these weapons." Frederick said seriously, "If you can't do it right, I'll make you wear a bee-proof suit and stuff a hornet's nest into it." Bruce's face lit up with a broad smile. Elsewhere, Almite explained to Richardnell the principles of several magic airguns on the table. "Isn't it just a blowgun?" Richardnell found something similar according to his own understanding. "How far can the projectile be blown?" Almite picked up an airgun and replied, "This is an automatic loading airgun prepared for the army. It has a caliber of 10 millimeters, and the projectile it fires can accurately make a hole half the size of a fist in a pig's leg at a distance of 200 meters. If you use it against a military formation without considering the accuracy, you can injure an unprotected person at a distance of 1 kilometer." Richardnell was playing with a bullet. The bullet had a pointed tip and a slightly contracted tail. The outer layer was a layer of copper pressed out of a mold, and the inside was filled with lead. He was stunned after hearing the data. Is it really that far? He was naturally familiar with the battlefield. Then the army will use this in the future. Frederick came over and said, "That's what I think. In the future, unless we face a master like you, our army will not be afraid of anyone." Richardnell shook his head and said, "Don't be so optimistic. The battlefield emphasizes damage, defense and speed. If you are strong in damage, others will offset the damage through defense and speed. If I were the enemy's commander, I would suffer a loss the first time, but the second time I would increase my defense and approach you as quickly as possible. As long as the casualties are within my acceptable range, it will be fine." There are such examples of battles. You have heard of the war between the Plantagenet and the Rose. The enchanted longbowmen of the Rose dynasty and the lightning rangers of the Plantagenet dynasty developed in confrontations with each other. Frederick nodded to accept the advice. All Might took a grenade launcher and a grenade and said, "We've considered this and plan to use this magic scroll launcher to slow the enemy down." Richardal took the slime-shelled magic grenade, tossed it in his hand, and nodded. Muck magic, a burst-casting magic circle, is good. As long as it's sudden, it can cause massive casualties before the enemy can counter. I suggest using compound magic. A little more time lost on the battlefield means more casualties. Bruce, standing nearby, quickly took out a thick parchment notebook and wrote down the Swordmaster's words word for word. It's safe to say these valuable lessons were earned at the cost of human lives. Frederick was very pleased with his performance. He had invited Richardal here today to hear his opinion on the new weapon and to see if there were any improvements that could be made. Richardal said, a little excitedly, "Let's try it first. We'll see how it works first." Frederick immediately arranged for someone to set up the target. These targets were wooden planks, as big as doors, placed on wooden frames. Their surfaces were coated with a thick layer of lime, and a head-sized circle painted with red paint. When a bullet hit one, the splashing lime could be used to determine its impact point. Someone had set up a ruler, placing several targets every 50 meters until the target was 500 meters away. Chapter 72 Springfields. Frederick took up the magic air rifle, developed according to standard equipment requirements, and began to examine it. Although he had previously submitted numerous opinions and suggestions, he had recently been at the manor writing a book, and this was his first time seeing the finished product. The gun was approximately 1.2 meters long and quite heavy, estimated to weigh 6 kilograms, slightly larger than the Type 56 semi-automatic rifle he had used in his previous life as a militiaman. The rectangular magazine below could hold 10 bullets, and the buttstock contained a thumb-sized magic crystal, which also provided space for maintenance tools. There was a safety above the trigger that cut off the magic circuit. The receiver had no openings, secured by hexagonal clips, and most of the parts were stamped. The front sight and sliding rear sight looked similar, but extensive data collection had yet to be performed, and the rear sight had not yet been made. The barrel had 6 grooves, and the twist angle and other parameters still needed to be determined through extensive testing. What left Frederick speechless was that these rifling lines were created by etching. The entire barrel was dipped in beeswax, and then the wax was scraped off, just like rifling. Then, it was dipped in acid extracted from the acid slime. He didn't know how effective it would be, so he'd just use it first. There was a cleaning rod under the barrel, and near the muzzle there was a rack reserved for bayonets and other accessories. Frederick inserted a magazine full of bullets and was about to reload when he suddenly discovered 2 problems that everyone had previously overlooked. This guy couldn't simply eject the bullet from the chamber. He had to first use an Allen wrench to open the receiver, remove the spray can, and then use the cleaning rod to poke the bullet out. It was impossible to tell whether there was a bullet in the chamber or not. It was impossible to tell. All Might said helplessly, "Looks like we need to add a handle to the jet can." Bruce pondered, "I don't think so. We could add a maintenance position to the safety." After opening it, a few magical muscles around the chamber push the jet can back in. That way, you can use a cleaning rod to push the pellets out, and you don't have to worry about dirt falling into the jet can when you're cleaning the barrel. Copper can conduct some magical elements. What if we add a magic circuit to the barrel that connects when a pellet is present? Then we could place a color-changing magic crystal there so we could tell at a glance. All Might thought for a moment, then nodded. Frederick said nothing, letting them play their own game. He placed the gun on a sandbag on the table, aimed at a target 50 meters away, and pulled the trigger. Boom! A powerful gust of wind elemental air erupted from the muzzle. Frederick felt the jetkin in the receiver move backward, then reset, pushing a bullet into the barrel. He pulled the trigger again, and this time the loud crack grew muffled. Almost instantly, a bullet blasted out of the barrel, striking precisely the center of the red circle on the target, sending up a puff of lime smoke. To his surprise, the gun's recoil was mild, likely due to the jet canister's recoil dissipating a lot of energy. Richardal's expression grew serious, and he patted Frederick on the shoulder, motioning for him to try it out. Frederick explained the instructions and handed the gun to him. Richardal fired a few slow shots at first, getting used to the feel, then emptied the remaining magazine at a target 200 meters away. He then replaced the magazine, aiming for a target at a maximum range of 500 meters, and demonstrated the terrifying prowess of a swordsman with his firearm. Frederick and his companions watched through the telescope as the first 2 rounds' impact points edged closer and closer to the red circle. The final 8 rounds all landed within or around the red circle, reaching the limits of accuracy for both the airgun and the bullet. "Very good," Richardnell said with satisfaction. "If I'm distracted, I'll be at a disadvantage at this distance." Frederick smirked and asked, "What about close range?" "That's easy," Richardnell said with a smile. "As soon as I see the muzzle, I know where it's going to hit. I'll keep my eye on your trigger finger, and if it moves, I'll dodge." Frederick picked up a 20mm double-barreled shotgun from the table, loaded it with shotgun shells, and fired 2 shots at a target 50 meters away, sending the target into a cloud of white smoke. "That's too much," Richardnell said with a smile. He took the double-barreled shotgun and, following Frederick's instructions, folded down the barrel and loaded it. This double-barreled shotgun was a smooth-bore shotgun, and it could take a variety of shotgun shells, from single-shot to 9-shot, all encased in slime-based shells. "The jet's power is a bit weak," Richardnell said after trying several shotgun shells. "No more than 100 meters, maximum. It's useless beyond that," Frederick said. "This gun is designed specifically for hunters and is intended for sale." Richardnell frowned slightly and asked, "What if someone learns how to do it?" Diesel then said, "Rest assured, the jet tanks and key components of these guns are made of special elemental metals. We're the only ones who can produce them cheaply right now. If others use ordinary metals to make them, they won't be much more powerful than bows and crossbows. If they use the same elemental metals, the price will be too high to mass produce them. As long as we control the raw materials, others won't be able to imitate them," Richardnell said with satisfaction. "That's good. The formula must be kept secret. I'm worried about others like me trying to steal it." Frederick's mouth twitched slightly. It would be difficult to deal with a sword master or a magic god acting as a spy. All Might, who knew the formula, just smiled confidently and said nothing. He picked up a folding rifle and handed it to Richardnell, saying, "This is one of the guns we're preparing for the militia." Richardnell fired a few shots, finding it similar to the semi-automatic air gun. He put it down and pointed at another gun on the table, asking, "Why is this one so big?" Frederick quickly replied, "This is also for the military. It uses the same ammunition as a hunting rifle, specifically for close-range combat." He then picked up a revolver and handed it to his master. "This gun holds 6 rounds, and the barrel is rotated by the recoil of a spray can. It's heavy," Richardnell said after firing 6 rounds. "But it works well. I'm afraid heavy cavalry wouldn't be able to get within 20 meters, and this small one too." He was referring to a revolver with an 8mm caliber, 8 mini-A rounds, and a barrel half the length of a palm. Frederick replied, "It's a backup gun. The spray can is small and stored inside the cylinder. It's mainly used for self-defense within 20 meters. Richardnell tested it on a target 50 meters away, and the bullet's erratic flight was speechless. "This is good." A wicked smile appeared on his face. "Make me a nice one. You can name the price," Frederick said. "That's no problem." This kind of gun was originally intended to be used not only to equip the army, but also to be decorated with beautiful patterns and sold as a collectible. Then they tried the magic grenade launcher. The 50mm grenade could hide about 300 meters, but the recoil was not small. Frederick sat down on the ground. Frederick got up, patted his butt, and pulled Bruce, who was trying to hold back his laughter, aside. He asked Bruce, "I plan to build a weapons workshop here. Is that okay?" Bruce immediately retracted his smile and replied, "No problem. It's also convenient to test weapons here, Master." "What should we call our weapons workshop?" Frederick looked at the field full of spring flowers and said, "Let's call it Springfield." Chapter 73 Spring Plowing. Under the warm sunshine and gentle spring breeze, the entire Wesson territory was bustling with activity. New settlers were cultivating farmland, canal construction was cutting down trees, craftsmen were busy in workshops, and a newly docked cargo ship was unloading its cargo at the dock. The scene was vibrant and full of life. At one manor, several farmers dragged a magical reciprocating machine in a large capstan to the edge of a field. Across the field, someone was tinkering with a plow. The long hemp rope from the capstan was hooked to the plow. The reciprocating machine and the capstan were connected and anchored to the ground with iron dowels. As the machine started, the capstan began to rotate, tightening the hemp ropes. Then, the plow, with its 6 plowshares, was dragged forward, leaving behind the plowed field. Immediately, a flock of birds descended from the sky, completely unafraid of humans, following closely behind the plow, pecking at the insects that emerged from the soil. A row of fields was quickly plowed, many times faster than before. The plow quickly turned around. A frame with a pulley had been secured to the opposite side of the field, and another long hemp rope was ready. All that was needed was the hemp rope from the capstan to be pulled across and connected to the iron hook, thus pulling the plow to the other side. Such a machine was infinitely faster than plowing with horses. If the farming season was tight, magic lamps could be installed to work at night, while the horses needed to rest. Outside a nearby greenhouse, Frederick was studying the temperature on a bimetallic thermometer. He had never understood the climate here. It was around 0 degrees Celsius in the early mornings of late January, then suddenly reached 10 degrees Celsius by the end of early February, then slowly rose in an upward trend, now around 15 degrees Celsius in early March. This caused the winter snow to melt quickly, and the water rushed into the river, causing flooding downstream. Last winter's snow was unprecedentedly heavy, leading to severe flooding downstream in the spring. Frederick observed for a while outside before entering a greenhouse. Professor Matthias was supervising students and farmers digging up sprouting potatoes from the ground, preparing to transplant them into the fields. The potatoes Madame Sophie had brought back were planted in a vat. They hadn't been well cared for on the ship, so they weren't growing well, not much bigger than an egg. According to her instructions, the planting instructions and accompanying diagrams she'd brought back, translated 5 times, a normal potato should be the size of a fist. Frederick had never farmed before, but in his previous life, he'd worked on a construction site in a suburban development zone. The workers and their families planted all sorts of vegetables wherever they could around the prefabricated buildings. Even the project office's flower beds were filled with tomatoes. Later, the project office published a scathing essay on overcoming difficulties in a difficult region to ensure vegetable self-sufficiency, which was posted on their official WeChat account. The essay made no mention of the local vegetable market, which was just 900 meters away. He knew how to plant potatoes. Several of the potatoes had sprouted, but they were too small to cut into pieces for planting. He squatted beside the potatoes he'd taken out and said to Matthias, "Keep the 3 largest sprouts on the top. I remember they're poisonous, so they need to be disposed of promptly." He then asked for a pair of rubber gloves, put them on, and picked up a potato, breaking off the side sprouts to demonstrate. Matthias thought for a moment and agreed, "Okay, I'll arrange for someone to do that later." People were familiar with thinning fruit, and the principle applied here as well. Frederick continued to squat there, tending to the potato sprouts, and asked, "Is the wood ash ready?" Matthias immediately replied, "It's ready. We can fertilize it right after we plant it." Frederick simply nodded silently and continued to work on the potatoes. Matthias noticed something was amiss with him and asked curiously, "Principal, is there something bothering you?" Frederick sighed deeply and said, "No money." Yesterday, he had calculated the territory's military budget and realized he had gone too far. The territory now had nearly 100,000 people, and Frederick planned to raise a regular army of 2,000 men once the new residents had settled into their lives, with the initial deployment set to begin this year. That day, Rich Gardner, returning from testing new weapons, spent 2 days discussing it with Almite, Old France, and a group of veteran mercenaries. Finally, they came up with a plan for a 4,000-man army. After reviewing the proposal, Frederick threw up his hands and exclaimed, "No money." These guys had every soldier, including the driver, assembled to the bone, even wearing armor. The Almite silver scale breastplate offered decent defense, but the problem was that it cost 5 florins each. Add to that the cost of a semi-automatic magic air rifle, 7 florins, an engineer's shovel, 2 kreutz, a steel helmet with lining, 16 kreutz, steel-toed stab-proof combat boots, 10 kreutz, and a yellow slime wash basin, 50 coppers. Frederick couldn't even calculate the cost. Matthias listened to his complaints with a faint smile, saying nothing more. This was a perfectly normal way to negotiate a budget. Who would be so foolish as to submit a standard price? It seemed the principal hadn't noticed the problem, and he'd likely do the same thing again, so he wasn't going to expose it. Frederick didn't know the actual cost of these new products, so he didn't react for a moment. "Let's go check out the other eastern crops," he said, standing up and removing his gloves. "They've all been planted now." As Matthias and he walked out, he said, "Spring wheat has been planted in the fields. The cabbage, Chinese cabbage, peppers, and tomatoes have sprouted and are ready to be transplanted to the main fields. It looks a bit cool now, so we'll plant the cucumbers and pumpkins later. The fields are well fertilized. I'm using blood meal to mix the seeds, not using magic for strengthening yet." As they spoke, they reached the potato field next to the greenhouse. The farmers, wearing gloves, sprinkled wood ash into the holes where the potato seedlings would be placed. Frederick nodded silently. Madame Sophie had given him 5 translated versions of the vegetable cultivation methods. He translated the original into Rhineland and then had it proofread by Psyche. The Eastern writing system in this world was slightly different from his own. For example, the characters for scholar and earth seemed reversed, and the character for spring had 4 horizontal strokes on top, 2 vertical strokes in the middle, and 2 horizontal strokes on the left and right. He could barely make sense of it given the context. Psyche said that she would teach him the language when the tomato and egg scrambled eggs were ready. The two continued walking forward and stopped at the edge of a field where soybeans were planted. Frederick had a lot of trouble planting soybeans in the beginning. In order to deceive him that these were golden beans that could be used to extract gold, Madame Sophie washed the beans very clean, and almost waxed them. This forced him to find root nodules from other plants to mix with the seeds before sowing. After the first crop, he selected the ones with the largest nodules and ground them for the second year before mixing with the seeds. Soybeans will be planted again this year, and next year they can be promoted in the territory. "I have a concern," said Matthias. "The Elizabeth potato has such a high yield, will it damage the soil?" The money Frederick used to buy seeds from Madame Sophie was left by his grandmother Elizabeth. In memory of his grandmother, he named the potato, which was destined to go down in history, after her. "Don't worry," Frederick said confidently. "Damage to the soil is inevitable, especially to the nutrients needed by the roots, so, like root crops like radishes, they can't be planted continuously. There should be at least a 4-year interval. Cropping a single crop year after year not only affects yield but also makes it more susceptible to pests and diseases. In those days, without pesticides, the most effective way to eliminate pests or pathogens in the soil was to starve them to death. For example, some pests that feed on radish roots. If the land is not planted with root crops like radishes for 2 or 3 years in a row but with other crops, the insects will starve to death instead of feeding on the roots." "Yes," Matthias nodded slightly. "But Elizabeth potatoes are a staple food, not a vegetable. I think the crop rotation needs to be improved. Let's go and check on the beets." Beets are cold resistant, so they were planted shortly after the snow melted in February. By now, small seedlings have sprouted. Matthias pointed at the beet seedlings and said, "I have strengthened the roots of these beets. I guess they will be as big as a fist after several generations of continuous strengthening." Frederick thought about the beets that big in his mind and said, "That's not bad. Even if they are not sweet, they can be used as vegetables and feed." At this time, a 10-year-old child ran over and said that he wanted to see the master because there was something going on at the farm. Chapter 74 Raising Chickens. Besides serving as experimental fields for Matthias, the farm also set aside an area for Manafro to research livestock and poultry. Wessenland had recently imported a large amount of livestock, and Manafro, along with his students, helped manage the livestock, only finding time for his own research in the autumn. Frederick assigned him a project, artificially hatching chickens and ducks. Chickens and ducks are easy to raise in Wessenland, boasting a high meat-to-feed ratio, egg production, and a short breeding cycle. Frederick, also eyeing down jackets, prioritized their development. Frederick arrived at the chicken yard and saw several teenage boys and girls carrying stacks of wooden pallets covered in thick cloth from a room. The chicks chirped from beneath the cloth. A plump lynx lay nearby, seemingly drooling over the fluffy chicks. It had clearly had a criminal record and was now wearing a halter and tied to a nearby tree with a short rope. Frederick rubbed the fat lynx's plump belly twice, then walked into the room with a sign that read incubator. The temperature inside the incubator was much higher than outside. The magic lamps were lit, and there were many chicks on the fire pit, ready to be moved out, their cries filled with activity. Manafro stood by the door and instructed his men to quickly get the chicks to the warm chick room. Frederick walked over and asked, "They look good. How long did it take, and what's the success rate, to raise chickens and ducks on a large scale?" Artificial incubation is essential. Relying solely on hens to hatch chicks is not enough. Frederick lit the fire pit and set up a thermometer in the winter, creating the conditions for artificial incubation. Manaflo replied, The incubation period is 19 to 20 days, and the current success rate is close to 60%. I overlooked a problem at the beginning. If I had solved it at that time, the success rate would probably be over 80%. Oh, Frederick asked curiously, what problem? Monofleur made a flipping gesture and said, turning the eggs, that is, turning the eggs every once in a while. I arranged different people to take care of the eggs. There was a girl who was particularly curious. It was fine in the first few days, but later she would pick up each egg every half a day to check it and put it back. The eggs she took care of had a particularly high success rate, close to 90%. I thought at first it might be because the eggs were turned over and heated evenly, so the success rate was high. It seems to be true. Yesterday I went to see the hens incubating eggs and found that the hens often turn those eggs over. Frederick said sincerely, thank you for your hard work. He also found out from the young man who came to call him on the road that Monofleur had spent a lot of effort on artificial incubation. In order to determine the incubation temperature, he specially took a thermometer to drill into the chicken cooperative. Monofleur put his hands on his hips and said proudly, now I have a new goal in life, which is to let everyone in the world eat chicken. Frederick smiled, and it was hard to tell whether he was joking or sincere, so he said, when your family arrives, I will give you a recipe for fried chicken nuggets. I'm sure your store will be popular. The new Wiesenberg fried chicken nuggets came into being, and later on, fried chicken that could fill you up for 10 copper coins became synonymous with Frederick's territory in some areas. Frederick continued, I think a king alone is too inefficient. How about this? A large cabinet with wooden brackets arranged like drawers. He used light to draw pattern in the air and continued, we could make a wooden frame like this, place an egg in each compartment, and then attach a piece of magic muscle so it slowly moves sideways at regular intervals to automatically flip the eggs. I heard that student at Almite who worked on the bimetallic thermometer has developed a temperature switch. You could talk to him and see if it could be used to automatically control the temperature inside the cabinet. You could also contact BASF and have them make some transparent hard plastic to attach to the door so you can see inside without opening it. He had seen commercial incubators on TV in his previous life, but he didn't know the specifics. He could only think of something similar and then slowly improve it. Monofleur wasn't familiar with mechanics, but it sounded like something like that. He nodded and said, I'll ask Almite later. As they spoke, the chicks in the incubator were moved out, and the two of them entered a breeding room. The temperature outside was still too low for the chicks. A stove burned outside the enclosure, with a ceramic chimney pipe heating the air. A bucket of water hung from the pipe to increase humidity. The floor of the enclosure was covered with sawdust. There was no need to sweep it later, just shovel the compost. The chicks wouldn't be able to eat until tomorrow, and they were still hungry. Monofleur led Frederick to the kitchen, where feed was being prepared. A wooden barrel held a dark brown solution soaked in crushed barley. This is my unique recipe, developed from a falcon's recipe. I've tried it on other chickens. Eating it every few days can reduce the chances of them getting sick, Monofleur said proudly. Frederick nodded and said, that's good. Chickens die in droves when they get sick. I heard that many years ago, before I was even born, the chickens and ducks in several of our territories were wiped out by plague. Monofleur thought for a moment and said, about 12 years ago, a traveling nobleman died after his falcon ate sick chickens and ducks. As they chatted, they left the kitchen and went to the chicken cooperative. The coop was a half-man high earthen wall with a shed on one side and a fishing net around it to prevent the chickens from flying away. There were several houses nearby where they raised insects to feed the chickens. Frederick looked at the chickens that were eating insects, and asked, don't chickens only eat insects, do they? Monofleur smiled and shook his head and said, no, in addition to insects, they are also fed grass, wheat and the residue left over from making Wesson sugar. The laying chickens are also fed bone meal. I will mix herbs into the feed so that they can eat more and grow faster. Frederick smiled and said, it would be best if they were all as fat as Zixi. I'm really impressed. The average lynx weighs only more than 20 kilograms. How did you raise it to almost 40 kilograms? Monofleur smiled helplessly, and without responding, he said, now we gather the strongest and most egg-laying chickens as breeding chickens. We hope to get chickens that lay more eggs and have more to meet in the future. Frederick nodded after listening. This is good. Principal, Monofleur suddenly asked a little nervously, are you free recently? Frederick replied curiously, I'm going to Lower at the end of the month. What's going on? Monofleur hesitated and said, we have something to discuss with you. It's very important. Chapter 75 Blackmailed. The sky was overcast, a drizzle falling, and occasional rumbles of spring thunder echoed through the clouds. Spring rain was as precious as oil, and the farmers in the fields were filled with bright smiles. Manuel and his companions had agreed to dine that evening and discuss matters with Frederick, but before dawn, Manuel arrived with Manafro, Matthias, and a dozen or so scholars and professors. The atmosphere in the living room was solemn. The scholars looked disheartened, glancing cautiously at Frederick. Frederick and Richardon looked grave, and even Psyche was gravely serious. "This is pure kidnapping and ransom," Katie roared angrily. "For an emperor to do this is outrageous," Richardon said in a sardonic tone, "and he even has the title of governor of Dacia." Frederick leaned back on the sofa and sighed deeply. Many things happened so suddenly, leaving no one unprepared. Last year, during the civil unrest in Constantinople, Manuel and his colleagues fled. Those living in the university and library took their families with them, but many who lived outside the city were unable to leave. Men like Manafro and Matthias, who lived outside the city, had already arranged for their families to move to their rural estates at the start of the unrest, where they also took in the families of many of their colleagues. Now that everyone is settled here, they've sent people back to fetch their families, but last night, they received devastating news. Phocas, the ultimate victor in the civil unrest, had been elected Emperor of the East Pleistocene. His election was a success, and now it was harvest time. A warlord, though not so good at making money through business, was adept at kidnapping and extortion. However, Phocas also knew how to maintain his reputation, offering you a small official position to enhance your reputation. Frederick never imagined that he would be blackmailed from over 1,000 kilometers away. He sighed and said solemnly, "The most important thing now is to ensure that after I give Phocas the formula for Wesson syrup, he will release me, rather than constantly adding more conditions." Reactions were mixed in the living room. Manafro and the others were overjoyed, while Richardon, Katie, and Taro, who was preparing to pour tea and water, were stunned. Everyone in Wesson territory understood the significance of Wesson syrup to the territory. Without it, there would be no food unloaded from the docks every day. Without food, over 60,000 people would starve. Richardon said to Frederick with a stern face, "You need to think it over carefully." Frederick smiled faintly, and said calmly, "I've thought it through clearly." Then he said to the sword saint, "Master, I would like to ask you and teacher Psyche to serve as my emissaries to Constantine to negotiate with Phocas. Archbishop Victor is in the Holy City now. You can contact him first and ask the Church of Light to intervene. Also, give Archbishop Victor a copy of the recipe for Wesson syrup." Many people knew that Wesson County's Wesson syrup was profitable, and some considered selling the recipe, but Frederick refused to do so to earn food. So Phocas took advantage of the fact that many families of Wiesenberg University were in his territory and kidnapped people for ransom. Frederick decided that since this was the case, he would muddy the waters, giving it not only to Phocas but also to the Church of Light. Archbishop Victor and Frederick are now in cahoots. Frederick's father will be canonized posthumously at an upcoming canonization ceremony. Given these two factors, the loss of exclusive control over the maltose formula could be offset by the Church of Light. Furthermore, with current productivity, no single entity could monopolize the vast market. Frederick could add a small expense to further filter and purify the existing maltose, and could also produce soft candies using agar and all-natural food coloring, potentially creating a brand name and allowing others to follow. All things considered, using maltose to save lives is a very cost-effective option. As for the Dacian province, it encompasses the lower Danube plains and the surrounding mountains. Separated from the Rhine Confederation by the Osmagian Empire, it boasts abundant grass and water, teeming with cattle and sheep. Alphu is currently buying sheep there to graze the weeds in the newly reclaimed villages. However, Dacia long ago achieved de facto independence with the support of the Osmagian Empire. The plains were then fragmented into independent tribes, while the mountainous and hilly regions were populated by less powerful nobles. Now that the Osmagian Empire was effectively controlling the region, the Eastland Empire's appointment of Frederick as governor of Dacia is pure deception. From Frederick's perspective, internally, King William might accuse him of treason, giving him an excuse to deal with him. Externally, if the Osmagian Empire, seeing someone stirring up trouble in its own backyard, intercepted cargo ships bound for Wesson territory, it would be a disaster. So, he ignored it, trying to stay hidden until he could grow up. Once that was done, it would be time to make the list. Richardon asked seriously, "Have you really decided?" Frederick replied solemnly, I've already decided. The Wessenland formula is unimportant compared to everyone's lives. Alright, Richardnell said, I'll run it for you. Psyche calmly said to Frederick, if you need anything else, I'll see if I can get it back for you. She was arguably the person who understood Frederick's thinking best, and from the outset, he wasn't surprised by the decision. Frederick thought for a moment and replied, you know me, and you know Constantinople, so let's do what we want. Earlier, after Psyche had wandered into Constantinople and found that everyone she knew had either left or been buried ankle-deep in the grass, she had created an assumed identity and been slacking off at the university, becoming familiar with the place. Psyche pondered this and turned to Manuel, saying, let's move the books from the library's basement. It's too dangerous to keep them there. Manuel, still absorbed in Frederick's self-sacrificing act of saving others, took a moment to react to Psyche's sudden question. The contents of the Imperial Library's underground vaults represent the culmination of thousands of years of pure and empire civilization, Manuel said gravely. What if someone falls along the way? Psyche replied matter-of-factly, then we can take the water route. All the boxes are sealed with film, so we won't have to worry about falling into the water. Manuel thought so, but there was still a problem. The old man sealed the vault door from the inside, swearing to live and die with it. We can't open it, haha, Psyche sneered. There's a secret passage leading outside. That guy might be enjoying himself in one of the baths right now. Don't forget the library's treasury is also inside. Manuel was stunned and asked uncertainly, how did you know there was a secret passage there? He had heard of Psyche before, but when he saw her in person, he thought it was someone with the same name. Their age and appearance didn't match, and Psyche's constant slacking at school made him misjudge the legend from the real person. He understood now, but it still seemed unbelievable, and he still felt the same way. He still had the idea that this Psyche was a descendant of the legendary Psyche. Now that Psyche had mentioned the secret passage, Manuel was half believing and half doubting. Psyche curled her lips and said, it's my fault, a bookish girl, that I'm always being bullied. Teachers are assigned cleaning chores, and while wiping the walls, I accidentally opened the secret passage. That's when I saw that guy coming back, reeking of alcohol and rose oil. I thought he was a thief. Manuel thought for a moment, then suddenly remembered something. That year, the old man said he broke his nose going down the stairs while drunk. Psyche sneered and said, I beat him. Frederick asked curiously, who are you talking about? This time it was Manuel's turn to sneer. Reflexively rolling up his sleeves, he replied, it's my distant uncle, Celsus, the director of the Imperial Library. This time, we must bring him back. Now that Frederick was willing to provide the recipe for Wessen's syrup, and with the swordmaster on his side, everyone relaxed and started talking and joking. Frederick's mouth twitched at this. Initially, they were discussing how to rescue the hostages, but now it had escalated to kidnapping. It's settled, he said. Everyone, make your arrangements and set off. These days, a long journey wasn't easy, a lot of preparation went into it. Furthermore, Richardnell was a crucial deterrent, so his departure had to be kept secret for a short period of time. As everyone thanked Frederick and dispersed, Frederick called Manafro to his study and asked, I haven't been very free lately. The other day, you said you had something to tell me. Manafro, a little embarrassed, said, actually, we're trying to ask the president for a position. Frederick understood immediately. Their families had arrived, and they were worried that their salaries at Wessenland University wouldn't be enough to support them, so they wanted to take on a second job. No problem, he said, the executive yuan will announce a new institutional department plan soon, and you can take up positions in it. By then, there will be departments specifically responsible for managing agriculture and animal husbandry, and you and Matthias can be the heads there. There is also an industrial department, and I plan to let Amit manage it. Many students are doing well as village chiefs in the new villages. I encourage more students or professors to take up positions in various departments. He thought it was just a small matter. The expansion and reform of various departments in the territory had been arranged by the executive yuan a long time ago. After several revisions, it was only now that the general direction was reluctantly decided. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.